Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I still struggle with this, even after all these years. I'm writing it down now because I need to get it off my chest, and maybe someone here has seen something similar. This happened back in '86 when I was a Marine stationed at Camp Pendleton. I was 24 then, in peak physical condition, and had been through enough training that I wasn't easily spooked by shadows in the woods. I'd done night ops plenty of times before. July 17th. I remember the date clearly because we were doing a recon aggressor force training exercise that night, and I'd been looking forward to it all week. The exercise itself was pretty standard. We were practicing withdrawal tactics after completing a simulated mission. It was around 3 in the morning when everything went sideways. I'd somehow gotten separated from my unit. It happens sometimes during night maneuvers, especially when you're trying to maintain noise and light discipline. We were using hand signals and keeping spread out, and at some point I realized I couldn't see any of my guys anymore. I wasn't particularly worried. We had predetermined rally points, and I knew the general direction they were heading. The night was quiet, that deep kind of quiet you only get in the wilderness at 3 a.m. The air was still warm from the July heat, but cooler than during the day. There was a nearly full moon that night, which was giving off enough light that I could see pretty well without my night vision gear. I could make out the trail, the trees, the bushes. Not in color, but the shapes were clear enough. I figured I could cut through a wooded area to intercept my unit rather than backtracking. It seemed like the smart play at the time. The trail I was on curved through the trees, and I was moving at a good pace, not running but walking quickly. I wasn't making much noise. That's something they drill into you in training. When I rounded a bend in the trail, that's when I saw it. The thing was just standing there in the middle of the path, maybe 10 feet in front of me. At first, my brain tried to process it as another Marine, but within a split second, I knew that wasn't possible. No human looks like that. It was tall. I'd estimate about 6.5 feet, maybe a bit more. Its entire body was covered in this light brown fur, almost like a coyote's coat, but smoother. But the face, Jesus, the face is what still haunts me. It had these massive black eyes, not like the almond-shaped eyes you hear about in alien stories. These were globe-shaped, big and round, reflecting the moonlight. They dominated its face, and the ears. They weren't like any animal I've ever seen. They were large, almost fox-like, but they angled outward sharply from its head. The nose was barely a nose at all, just these prominent slit-like nostrils with very little definition around them. Its body was muscular but strangely proportioned. It had this narrow waist, almost too narrow for its broad shoulders. The arms were what really struck me as wrong. They were unusually long, hanging well below its hips, the kind of proportions that just look off on a living thing. When I first saw it, its back was partially towards me, but then it noticed me. I'll never forget how it moved. It had this startle reflex, this little jerk of surprise, like I'd caught it off guard. It's weird, but that very human-like reaction was almost scarier than if it had roared or something. We both froze for what felt like forever, but was probably only a couple of seconds. I was running through my options. I had my service weapon, but it wasn't loaded with live rounds for the exercise. I had a knife, but the thought of getting close enough to use it made my stomach turn. Then it moved. It didn't run away like a startled animal would. It slowly crouched down, then knelt behind a bush along the side of the trail. The way it moved was so deliberate, so calculated. It started moving sideways, keeping low, never taking those big black eyes off me. It was being cautious, like it was assessing the threat I posed. I couldn't move. My training, all those years of discipline, just evaporated. I stood there watching this thing watch me. The moonlight was strong enough that I could see details I wish I couldn't. The way its fur moved slightly in the light breeze, the slight expansion of its chest as it breathed, the intent focus in those eyes. It kept shifting position, always maintaining eye contact with me. There was intelligence there, not just animal instinct. It was thinking, planning. That's what shook me the most. This wasn't just some creature operating on instinct. It was observing, calculating. After what seemed like an eternity, it started backing away, still in that half-crouch. It moved deeper into the woods, but slowly, deliberately. It wasn't panicking. It was retreating tactically, keeping me in sight until there were enough trees between us that I couldn't see it anymore. When I couldn't see it any longer, I finally snapped out of my paralysis. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. My mouth had gone completely dry, and I realized I'd been holding my breath. I felt cold sweat running down my back, despite the warm night. I don't know how long I stood there after it disappeared. It could have been minutes. I kept staring into the woods where it had gone, straining my eyes to see if it was still watching me. The forest had gone completely silent. No insects, no night birds, nothing. Just dead quiet. I didn't want to follow my original plan anymore. The thought of moving deeper into those woods, potentially in the same direction as that thing, made my skin crawl. But I also didn't want to turn my back on where it had gone. Eventually, self-preservation kicked in, and I backed up, keeping my eyes on the spot where I'd last seen it, until I reached the bend in the trail. Then I turned and moved as quickly and quietly as I could back the way I'd come. I rejoined my unit about 30 minutes later at one of the rally points. I was shaking, covered in sweat. My sergeant asked me where the hell I'd been, and I just muttered something about getting turned around in the dark. I couldn't bring myself to tell anyone what I'd seen. Who would believe me? Hey guys, I just saw some kind of Bigfoot alien hybrid in the woods. Yeah, right, I'd never hear the end of it. But it wasn't a bear, it wasn't a person in a suit. The way it moved was too fluid, too natural. The proportions were all wrong for a human. And those eyes, no mask could capture the intelligence I saw in those eyes. For weeks afterward, I couldn't sleep properly. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those black globe-shaped eyes staring back at me. I volunteered for daytime patrols and training exercises, but found excuses to avoid night ops. Eventually, my sergeant pulled me aside and asked what was wrong. I made up some bullshit about having trouble with night vision after a flashbang went off too close during training. He seemed skeptical, but let it go. I spent my remaining time at Pendleton looking over my shoulder whenever I was near the woods. I researched local wildlife obsessively, trying to find anything that matched what I'd seen. I found nothing. I never went back to those woods alone. When my service ended, I left California altogether. I couldn't stand being near those forests anymore. I've told this story exactly 3 times in my life. The first time was to my dad, who was also a Marine. He listened silently, then asked if I'd been drinking that night. I hadn't. The second time was to my wife, about 5 years into our marriage. She suggested I talk to someone professional about PTSD. The third time was to a guy I met at a bar who claimed to have seen something similar near Mount Shasta. He was the only one who didn't think I was crazy or hallucinating. I'm not saying it was an alien or a cryptid or whatever. I'm just telling you what I saw. A 6.5-foot tall, fur-covered creature with fox-like ears and huge black eyes that moved with intelligence and purpose. It wasn't aggressive, but it was aware. It knew I was there, and it made decisions based on my presence. Sometimes I wonder if it was as scared of me as I was of it. The way it startled when it saw me suggests it wasn't expecting to encounter a human, but the way it retreated, cautious, strategic, always keeping me in sight, that wasn't fear. That was survival intelligence. I still have nightmares sometimes, not as often as I used to, but they still come. I'm back on that trail, rounding that bend, and there it is, But in the dreams, it doesn't retreat. In the dreams, it comes toward me, those long arms reaching out, those black eyes fixed on mine. I always wake up before it reaches me. I've tried to convince myself over the years that it was just stress, lack of sleep, maybe even some kind of hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But deep down, I know what I saw. It was real. It was there on that trail, watching me with those intelligent eyes. What haunts me most is not knowing what it was. Was it some undiscovered species living in the remote areas of Camp Pendleton? Was it something not from here? I don't know, and I don't think I want to know. All I know is that there was something in those woods that night, something that shouldn't exist, according to what we know about the natural world. Something that watched me with intelligence and purpose. And for all I know, it's still out there, watching from the trees when humans venture too deep into its territory. I've never gone hiking alone since then. I've never gone camping without at least 3 other people. I always sleep with a flashlight next to my bed. And to this day, I can't look at the full moon without remembering those eyes reflecting its light. That's my story. Take from it what you will. Maybe I'm just a crazy ex-Marine who saw a bear and panicked, but I know what I saw, and whatever it was, it saw me too. Story 2. I've never shared this with anyone outside my closest hunting buddies. Even now, typing this out, my hands are getting clammy. It's been 14 years, but I remember every single detail like it was yesterday. Back in October 2009, I headed out for my annual elk hunt in the Bitterroot Mountains of Idaho. I was 43 then, had been hunting those mountains since I was a teenager. My dad taught me every trail, every ridge, every seasonal elk pattern in those parts. I knew that land better than the back of my hand, or at least I thought I did. This particular trip, I decided to go solo. My usual hunting partner had a family emergency, and I figured I'd been doing this long enough to manage on my own. I packed light, just my compound bow, basic survival gear, some jerky, trail mix, water, and a small tent. The forecast called for cold but clear conditions, perfect for elk hunting. I hiked about 7 miles in from the nearest road access point, pushing deep into an area where I'd had luck in previous seasons. It was remote enough that most weekend warriors wouldn't venture that far. The morning was crisp, frost covering the ground, my breath visible in puffs of steam. The mountains were alive with the sound of bull elk bugling in the distance. God, I love that sound. It's primal, ancient, tells you you're part of something bigger than yourself. By early afternoon, I found a perfect spot. It was a small rise overlooking a meadow near the tree line, with good cover from a cluster of mature pines. The wind was in my face, carrying my scent away from where I expected the elk to emerge at dusk. I settled in, set up my small blind, and prepared for the wait. This is my favorite part of hunting, the quiet anticipation, becoming one with the forest. I've always felt at peace out there. Around 4 in the afternoon, something changed. I didn't notice it at first, but then it hit me. The forest had gone completely silent. No elk bugling, no squirrels chattering, no birds calling, nothing. Just this heavy, oppressive silence that felt wrong on every level. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. Anyone who spends time in the wilderness knows this silence is a warning. Something was off. My first thought was mountain lion, maybe a bear. I'd encountered both before and knew how to handle myself, but something felt different this time. The silence wasn't just unusual, it was absolute. That's when I heard it. A loud crack from deeper in the forest, maybe 100 yards behind me. Not a gunshot, not an animal call. The unmistakable sound of wood breaking, and not a small branch. This was the sound of substantial timber giving way under tremendous force. I froze, barely breathing. Then another crack, followed by the distinct sound of a sapling snapping completely in half, then a heavy thud as it hit the ground. This wasn't an elk raking its antlers against a tree. This was something physically breaking tree trunks. The breaking continued. Another sapling snapped, then another. Each break was followed by the heavy sound of wood hitting the forest floor. Whatever was doing this was methodical, deliberate. Then I heard something that made my blood run cold. Footsteps, heavy, bipedal footsteps, pacing back and forth behind the screen of trees. These weren't the four-beat rhythm of a deer or elk. They weren't the padding of a predator. They were the distinct, heavy thump-thump of something walking on 2 feet. But they were heavier, more powerful than any human footfalls I'd ever heard. I slowly raised my binoculars, trying to keep my hands from shaking. Through the gaps in the brush, I glimpsed something moving between the trees. It was massive, towering over the brush line, which I knew to be about 7 feet high in that area. It had broad shoulders, incredibly long arms, and was covered in what looked like dark hair or fur. I couldn't make out details clearly, just this hulking silhouette moving with surprising agility through the dense forest. Whatever this creature was, it began systematically breaking young lodgepole pines. These weren't saplings, mind you. Some were 7 or 8 feet off the ground, well above where any normal person could reach. It would grab one, snap it with what sounded like an audible grunt, toss it aside like it weighed nothing, then move to another, thicker one and break that too. The sound echoed across the meadow, bouncing off the mountains. I sat there completely motionless, torn between disbelief and terror. My bow felt laughably inadequate. I faced down charging moose, aggressive bears, and once a mountain lion that took an interest in me. I know wilderness dangers. This was something else entirely. As daylight began to fade, the intimidation display, because that's what I now realized it was, intensified. The creature roared. Not a bear's roar, not an elk's bugle, not any sound I've heard in 30 years of wilderness experience. This was a deep, chest-vibrating sound that seemed to come from something with massive lungs. It was primal, threatening, and unmistakably directed at me. The creature began circling through the trees, always staying within the tree line, but never entering the open meadow. It would snap trees, roar, pace, then repeat the pattern in another location. For nearly 2 hours, this continued as darkness fell completely. I had a small flashlight, but didn't dare turn it on. My hunting knife was in my hand, though I knew it would be useless if that thing decided to come for me. I considered making a run for it, but my instincts told me to stay still. Running would only trigger a chase. The temperature dropped dramatically after sunset. I was shivering, partly from cold, mostly from fear. Every crack of timber made me flinch. Every heavy footstep felt like it was getting closer. And then, suddenly, it stopped. The silence returned, but different this time. Complete and eerie. I waited, straining to hear any indication of where it had gone. Nothing. Just the wind through the pines and my own thundering heartbeat. I spent that night huddled against the base of a large pine, bow in my lap, knife at the ready. I didn't sleep, couldn't sleep. Every sound, real or imagined, had me on high alert. At some point, my exhaustion must have overtaken my fear because I dozed off briefly. I jolted awake at first light, disoriented and cold. For a split second, I wondered if I'd dreamed the whole thing. Then I remembered, and fear washed over me again. I waited until the forest returned to its normal sounds, birds calling, squirrels chattering, before cautiously moving. I had to see what had happened, had to confirm what I'd witnessed. What I found chilled me to the bone. Multiple young lodgepole pines, some with trunks thicker than my wrist, broken clean in half. Not cut, not chewed by beaver, but snapped with brute force. Their splintered tops were lying nearby, tossed aside. The ground around was churned up with large impressions, though it was too dry for clear prints. One break was at least 8 feet off the ground. I'm 6'1", and I had to reach well above my head just to touch the break point. Whatever did this was tall, strong, and it had wanted me to know it was there. I gathered my gear with shaking hands and hiked out of there as quickly as I could. I finished my hunt in another drainage about 5 miles away, but my heart wasn't in it anymore. Every sound in the forest made me jump. Every shadow seemed threatening. That was 14 years ago. I still hunt, but never alone, and never in that part of the Bitterroots again. I've faced bears and cougars before, confronted aggressive moose, even had a standoff with a wolverine once. Those encounters left me respectful, but confident. This left me fundamentally changed. The sound of breaking trees now carries a weight with it. Sometimes, on cold October nights when the wind blows just right, I swear I can hear that roar again. That deep, chest-vibrating sound that came from something that wasn't supposed to exist. Something that used intimidation to warn me away from its territory. I've read the reports, seen the shows, heard other hunters' tales. I never believed them before. Now, I don't know what to believe. All I know is what I experienced that day in the Bitterroot Mountains, and I know that I'll never forget the sound of those trees breaking or the heavy footsteps that paced around my position as darkness fell. The wilderness holds secrets. Some of them, I've decided, are better left undisturbed. Story 3. I still don't sleep well some nights. It's been 12 years since that day in September of 2011, but whenever I close my eyes and it's quiet enough, I can still hear that sound, the awful crack of that tree snapping like it was nothing more than a toothpick, and that rumble, that deep, chest-vibrating growl that wasn't like anything I've ever heard before or since. I've always been an experienced solo hiker. I grew up in northern BC and have spent half my life in the woods. I'm not some city guy who panics at normal forest sounds or mistakes a bear for something else. I know what I saw that day near Prince George. I had taken a week off work to just decompress, you know? Needed to get away from everything and everyone. The area I picked was pretty remote, about 20 miles from the nearest main road. I parked my truck at this little pull-off and hiked in about 5 miles to a spot I'd never been before. It was beautiful. Tall pines, some rocky outcroppings, and a nice little creek about 100 yards from where I set up camp. Perfect spot, or so I thought. The first weird thing I noticed was how quiet it was when I arrived. And I don't mean peaceful quiet. I mean unnaturally silent. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. Anyone who spends time in the woods knows that's not normal. There's always something moving around or making noise. But this was different. Like the forest was holding its breath. I tried to shake off the feeling and set up my tent in this small clearing. I got everything organized, hung my food pack from a tree, bear country, you know, and still had a few hours of daylight left. I decided to explore a bit, maybe check out the creek to see if there were any fish. So I grabbed my knife, thank God I did, and headed away from my campsite, walking deeper into the trees. I was maybe half a mile from camp when I first heard it. There was this heavy movement sound, not like a deer or even a bear. This was bigger, heavier, like something massive moving through the underbrush. My first thought was moose, honestly. They're huge and can make a racket when they want to. But then I caught movement ahead through the trees. About 50 yards in front of me, there was this figure. At first, my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. It was standing upright, but it wasn't a person. It was massive. I'm 6 feet tall, and this thing had to be at least 8 or 9 feet and wide. Christ, those shoulders were like a refrigerator. It had both hands gripped on this young tree, probably 6 inches thick, and I just stood there watching as it pushed against it, just pushed. The tree started to bend, and then there was this awful cracking sound. The wood splintering sounded like gunshots in that silent forest, and then the tree just went down. Just like that, snapped clean and crashed to the forest floor. I couldn't move. My whole body felt like it was made of lead. I was frozen in place, partly hidden behind this big pine tree, just watching. The thing, the Sasquatch. Because that's what it was, I have no doubt about that now. It leaned down over the fallen tree, examining it almost. That's when I really saw it clearly. It was covered in this dark brown hair, not black like you sometimes hear, but deep chocolate brown, and not matted or dirty looking. It was almost glossy in the patches where the sun hit it through the canopy. But its face, Jesus, its face. It had this heavy brow ridge that shadowed its eyes, making them look sunken. The nose was wide and flat, almost like a gorilla's, but different, and its mouth wide with these lips that seemed almost human, but not quite. I could see muscles moving under all that hair. Not fat, not at all. This thing was built like a bodybuilder, but natural, you know? Like every inch of it was designed for raw power. And those hands, they weren't paws. They were hands with fingers, long fingers like sausages that wrapped completely around that tree trunk. The proportions were all wrong, though. Arms too long for its body, hanging down past its knees when it straightened up. I think I was holding my breath the whole time. I didn't dare move. Then it did something that made my blood run cold. It let out this sound, not a roar like a bear or a scream. It was this deep, rumbling growl that I felt more than heard. I swear to God, I could feel it vibrating in my chest cavity. It was like standing next to a massive speaker at a concert, but deeper, more primal. After that, it stepped right over the fallen tree, just one step, that's how tall it was, and walked into this small clearing. It stood there for what felt like forever, but was probably only 30 seconds, just looking around. I was convinced it knew I was there. I was convinced I was going to die. Then, for whatever reason, it turned and moved away, heading into the thicker part of the forest to my right. It didn't run or even hurry. It just walked with this strange, fluid gait that ate up distance faster than you'd think. It moved like something that owned the forest, that had nothing to fear. I don't know how long I stood there after it disappeared from sight. Could have been 5 minutes or an hour. When I finally tried to move, my legs were shaking so badly I actually fell to my knees. I was covered in cold sweat, and I realized I'd pissed myself a little. Not proud of that, but it's the truth. The sun was starting to set by then, and I had a choice to make. Try to get back to my camp or just stay where I was until morning. The thought of being in those woods in the dark, with that thing out there, but the thought of trying to navigate back to my truck in the dark was even worse. So I decided to go back to camp and get the hell out at first light. I moved as quietly as I could, constantly looking over my shoulder. Every snap of a twig made me jump. When I finally made it back to my campsite, I couldn't even force myself to get into my tent. It felt too vulnerable, too much like being gift-wrapped. So I just sat with my back against a tree, knife in my hand, watching the darkness close in. That night was the longest of my life. I didn't sleep, not even for a minute. I just sat there listening to the forest, and the forest was still dead silent, except for a few times when I heard heavy movement in the distance. Each time, I'd grip my knife tighter, knowing full well it would do absolutely nothing against something that could snap a tree with its bare hands. Around midnight, I heard that rumbling growl again, distant but clear. And then there was a response from the opposite direction. Another growl, similar but different, slightly higher in pitch. That's when I realized there might be more than one of them out there. I nearly threw up from fear. I also started to notice rocks and pine cones landing in my campsite throughout the night. Not thrown hard, just tossed, like something was letting me know they were there, watching. One landed about 2 feet from me around 3 in the morning, and I had to stuff my fist in my mouth to keep from screaming. When the first hint of dawn came, I didn't wait another second. I grabbed only my essentials, left the tent, my cooking gear, everything else. Just took my backpack with my wallet, keys, water, and a granola bar. I started walking fast, not running, because I was afraid running might trigger something, but as fast as I could walk. I made it back to my truck by mid-morning. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. I drove straight home without stopping, checking my rearview mirror the whole way, like I expected to see that thing running after me down the highway. For weeks afterward, I had terrible nightmares. Still do sometimes. In them, I'm back in that forest, and I'm running, but I can feel hot breath on the back of my neck. I always wake up right before whatever's chasing me catches up. I've told very few people about what happened. My brother, a close friend. Most people would think I was crazy or making it up, but I know what I saw. I know what I heard. That sound, that tree breaking, it wasn't natural. The power it would take to snap a 6-inch trunk like that, it's not something any known animal could do. I've researched Sasquatch encounters since then. Read every book, every online forum. Some details match up with other sightings. The height, the build, the way it moved. But I've never read about anyone seeing one break a tree like that. The casual display of strength was what terrified me most. It wasn't even trying hard. It was like watching someone snap a pencil. I haven't been camping alone since then. Haven't been back to that area near Prince George at all. Sometimes I think about going back with other people, maybe trying to find evidence. But then I remember that sound, that deep, rumbling growl that made my insides shake. And I know I never will. Some things, once you've seen them, you can't unsee. And some places, once you realize what's watching you from the trees, you can never feel safe in again. I don't know what that creature was exactly, but I know it was real. And I know it's still out there in those woods, snapping trees like twigs and letting out that bone-chilling growl that I still hear in my dreams. Story 4. Me and 2 friends, let's call them J and M, had been planning this backpacking trip to Olympic National Park for months. We're all experienced hikers from Portland who'd done plenty of weekend trips, but this was our first time in the Hoh rainforest. If you haven't been there, it's this incredibly lush, almost prehistoric-looking place with massive trees covered in hanging moss. The kind of place that feels ancient and alive. We'd hiked about 7 miles in that day, following the river trail, before veering off to a more secluded spot we'd researched. By late afternoon, we found this perfect little clearing near a small stream. The trees around us were enormous, like hundreds of feet tall, creating this natural cathedral feeling. We set up our 2 tents, collected firewood, and got dinner going before the sun went down. Everything was normal at first. We ate freeze-dried meals, had a few beers we'd packed in, worth the extra weight, and sat around the fire telling stories. The first weird thing I noticed was around 9 p.m. when the forest just went quiet. At first, I didn't really register it consciously, but then I realized I couldn't hear any of the usual forest sounds. No frogs, no insects chirping, nothing. Jay noticed it too and said something like, "Man, it got really quiet all of a sudden." We figured maybe it was just the temperature dropping or something, but looking back, it was like all the wildlife knew something was coming. By 11, we'd put out the fire and were getting ready for bed. J and M were sharing the larger tent, and I had the smaller one to myself. I was just settling into my sleeping bag when I heard this loud thunk about 10 feet from my tent. It sounded like something heavy hitting the ground. "What was that?" I called out to the other tent. "Probably just a pine cone," M called back. Then a few minutes later, thunk, another one, closer this time. I unzipped my tent a bit and shined my headlamp out. It was a rock about the size of my fist, just sitting there where nothing had been before. "Guys, someone just threw a rock near my tent," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Jay's voice came back. "What? Are you serious?" "Yeah, there's a rock right here that wasn't here before." We all got quiet, listening. The silence was intense. Then another rock landed, this one hitting the ground between our tents with a heavy thud. "Holy shit," M whispered from their tent. "Someone's out there." My first thought was that maybe some other hikers were messing with us, but we hadn't seen anyone else for miles that day. We were pretty far off the main trail. I was about to suggest we call out to whoever it was when we heard it. Movement in the trees. Not like a person walking, but something much heavier. The ground seemed to vibrate slightly with each step. And then came this breathing, these deep, rough huffing sounds that were unlike anything I'd ever heard. Not like a bear or any animal I know. The breaths were so powerful, I could actually see the sides of my tent move slightly with each exhalation. That's when the smell hit us. God, I'll never forget that smell. It was this powerful, musky odor, like wet animal fur, mixed with something rotten and something, I don't know, almost human-like, but not quite. It was so strong it made my eyes water. "Do you smell that?" I whispered as loudly as I dared. "Yeah," Jay answered, his voice shaking. "What the fuck is that?" More rocks started landing around us, not hitting our tents directly, but getting closer each time. It was like whatever was out there was testing us, seeing how we'd react. The footsteps circled our camp, moving with deliberate slowness. I was frozen in my sleeping bag, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I had my hunting knife clutched in one hand and my flashlight in the other, though I didn't dare turn it on now. Then came the wood breaking, crack. It sounded like something was snapping thick branches like they were twigs. Not small branches either, but the kind that would take serious strength to break. Each crack was followed by those huffing breaths, now sounding agitated and forceful. "What do we do?" Em whispered from the other tent. "Stay completely still," Jay replied. "Don't make any sudden movements or sounds." We had bear spray, but whatever was out there didn't sound like a bear. Bears don't throw rocks. Bears don't walk around on two legs for extended periods. Bears don't circle camps like they're sizing you up for what felt like forever, but was probably about 20 minutes. The thing continued circling, throwing rocks occasionally, breaking branches, and making those breathing sounds. I was trembling so hard I had to clench my jaw to keep my teeth from chattering. Then it went quiet again. Too quiet. I strained my ears, trying to figure out where it had gone. Had it left? Was it standing still, watching us? That's when I made a decision. I still don't know if it was brave or incredibly stupid. I needed to see what was out there. I carefully, silently shifted position so I could peer through a tiny gap where my tent flap wasn't fully zipped. At first, I couldn't see anything beyond the clearing. Then, at the edge of the trees, something moved. I squinted, trying to make sense of what I was seeing in the dim moonlight. And then it stepped forward slightly. I still struggled to describe it accurately because my brain almost couldn't process what I was seeing. It was massive, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, standing upright on 2 legs. It was covered in dark hair, not fur exactly, but thick hair that hung in places. The shoulders were incredibly broad, way wider than any human's, and its arms were proportionally too long, hanging down almost to its knees. But it was the face that made my blood turn to ice. The head was large, sitting directly on those massive shoulders, with hardly any neck visible. It had this heavy brow ridge that shadowed whatever eyes were there, and the head seemed to slope back without much of a forehead. The chest was barrel-shaped and powerful. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a man in a suit. It was a Sasquatch, a fucking Bigfoot, standing there at the edge of our camp, watching us. As I stared, unable to look away, it suddenly jerked its head in my direction as if it knew I was watching it. I dropped back into my sleeping bag, my heart nearly exploding in my chest. I heard it move again, heavy footsteps coming slightly closer to my tent. Another rock landed, this one hitting the side of my tent with a sharp tap before falling to the ground. I bit my hand to keep from making any sound. For the next hour or so, it continued this bizarre intimidation ritual, pacing, throwing rocks, breaking branches with loud, deliberate cracks, occasionally letting out these low, rumbling sounds that weren't quite growls, but something deeper and more unsettling. Around 1:30 in the morning, it moved to the other side of the camp, near where our food was hanging in a tree. We'd bear-proofed it as you're supposed to. I heard sniffing, more huffing, and then what sounded like frustration. A short, muffled sound that was almost like a grunt of annoyance. The whole time, none of us said a word. We were communicating through text messages, our phones hidden under sleeping bags to mask the light. Jay was suggesting we should make a lot of noise and try to scare it off, like you would with a bear. Em thought we should just stay silent and hope it lost interest. I couldn't stop thinking about how easily that thing could tear through our tents if it wanted to. Finally, around 2 a.m., the footsteps began to move away. The breathing sounds grew fainter. The horrible smell gradually dissipated. We lay there in silence for another hour at least, nobody daring to move or speak, before Jay finally whispered, "I think it's gone." None of us slept. We just lay there, listening to every sound in the forest, jumping at every natural creak or rustle. As soon as the first light of dawn appeared, we were out of our tents. The evidence was everywhere. Rocks scattered all around our camp that hadn't been there the night before. There were impact marks on some logs near our fire pit where rocks had hit. Several branches were broken about 8 feet up in the trees, right above where our tents were set up. Branches that would require something very tall and very strong to break. But the footprints, those are what made it impossible to deny what had happened. Near the tree line where I'd seen it standing, there were deep impressions in the soft forest floor. They were footprints, but not human. About 16 inches long with 5 distinct toe impressions, much wider than a human foot. The stride length between them was enormous, easily twice what mine would be. We didn't even discuss it. We packed up immediately. No breakfast, no coffee, nothing. We just stuffed everything into our packs as quickly as possible and started hiking out. 7 miles never felt so long. We kept looking over our shoulders, kept our bear spray in hand the whole time. When we finally reached the ranger station, we were exhausted, shaking, and probably looked like we'd seen a ghost. We debated whether to report it. What would we even say? That Bigfoot harassed our campsite all night? That we had a rock-throwing contest with Sasquatch? In the end, we just signed out and left. I've been back in the mountains plenty of times since then, but never to the Hoh rainforest. I can't bring myself to go back there. Sometimes, I still wake up in the middle of the night, thinking I hear those deep, huffing breaths outside my window, or catching a whiff of that distinctive musky smell. I don't care if people believe me or not. I know what I saw. I know what happened that night, and I know now why so many of these sightings happen in the Pacific Northwest forests. Something lives in those woods that science hasn't classified yet. Something intelligent enough to throw rocks, strong enough to snap thick branches, and deliberate enough to intimidate rather than attack. I still have one of the rocks. I keep it on my desk as a reminder that there are things in this world we don't understand. Things that exist whether we want to believe in them or not. And story 5. I've never told this story outside of my immediate family. I'm honestly not sure how people will take it. But I've carried this with me for so long, and after reading some of your experiences, I feel like maybe someone here will understand or have seen something similar. This happened back in February of '76. February 22nd to be exact. Some dates just burn themselves into your memory, you know? I was driving with my wife and our 2 kids northwest of Great Falls, Montana. We were on our way back from visiting my wife's sister in Shelby. It was around 10 in the morning, clear day, good visibility. I remember I was thinking about getting back home in time to catch the hockey game. We were about 5 miles outside of Great Falls on the freeway when I noticed something moving in an open field to our right. At first, I thought it was a bear, maybe, but bears don't usually come out in February, and something about the way it was moving just seemed off. I slowed the car down. "What are you doing?" my wife asked. The kids were in the back, half asleep. "Look over there," I said, pointing. That's when I saw it clearly. This wasn't a bear. This thing was walking upright, striding across that open field with a purpose. I pulled over onto the shoulder, my heart suddenly pounding in my chest. I told my wife to stay in the car with the kids. I had a pistol in the glove compartment. I always carried it when we traveled, just for protection. I grabbed it, checked it was loaded, and stepped out. My wife was whispering urgently through the cracked window, "What are you doing? Get back in the car." But I couldn't. I needed to see this thing better. I needed to know what the hell I was looking at. The creature, and I don't know what else to call it, was massive. I'm 6 feet tall, but this thing had to be at least 7 feet, maybe more. Its shoulders were incredibly broad, I'd guess nearly 3 feet across. The whole body was covered in dark, rough hair. Not fur exactly, but coarser, almost like bristles, dark brown, almost black. What really struck me was how it moved. Each stride it took would have taken me 2 or 3 steps to cover the same ground. Its arms were longer proportionally than a human's, and they swung differently, lower. There was a strange efficiency to its movement, nothing wasted, nothing extra. But here's where things get really weird. As I stood there watching, I noticed something in the sky, directly above the creature. There was a grey, oval-shaped object hovering about 100 feet up. No wings, no blades, no sound, nothing that could explain how it was staying up there, and it was moving in perfect sync with the creature, keeping pace as it walked across that field. I stood there, pistol in hand, not knowing what to think. My first thought was government experiment, but that didn't make sense either. This was 1976. We didn't have silent aircraft that could hover like that. And what government would be testing something with a giant, hairy humanoid in an open field next to a freeway? I took a few steps closer, moving away from the car. The tall grass was wet with morning dew, soaking through my pant legs. The air was cold, but I wasn't feeling it. My focus was entirely on what I was seeing. I moved carefully, keeping my pistol pointed down but ready. I must have been about 100 yards away from the creature when it suddenly stopped walking. Then slowly, deliberately, it turned toward me. I froze. My finger instinctively moved closer to the trigger, but I didn't raise the gun. Something told me that would be a terrible idea. The creature's face, I'll never forget it as long as I live. It wasn't an animal face, but it wasn't human either. Its head sat squarely on its shoulders without much of a neck. Its face was dark, with a heavy brow that shadowed its eyes. I couldn't make out the eye color from that distance, but I could feel it looking right at me, studying me the same way I was studying it. We stood like that for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds. I was aware of the oval craft above, still hovering, still silent. I became conscious of my own breathing, too loud in my ears. My palms were sweaty despite the cold, making the pistol grip slippery in my hand. Then I took a step backward. I don't know why. Instinct, I guess. Something primitive in my brain was screaming danger. Not that the creature had made any threatening moves, but there was a power there, an intelligence that I could feel even at that distance. After I stepped back, the creature seemed to lose interest. It turned away from me and continued its walk across the field. The oval craft moved with it, maintaining that perfect position overhead. I backed up to the car, never taking my eyes off them. My wife was staring wide-eyed through the windshield. The kids had woken up and were trying to see what was happening, but my wife had told them to stay down. "What is it?" she whispered as I got back in the car. "I don't know," I said honestly. "But we need to watch where it goes." We sat there in the car on the shoulder of the freeway. A few other cars passed by, but nobody else stopped. I wondered if they could see what we were seeing, or if they just thought we were having car trouble. The creature continued across the field toward a line of trees about a quarter-mile away. Its stride never changed, purposeful and direct. The oval craft kept pace overhead, no lights, no sound, just that perfect synchronized movement. As they neared the tree line, I expected the craft to rise up to clear the trees, but that's not what happened. Instead, both the creature and the craft seemed to fade from view. Not like they went behind something or were obscured. They literally became less distinct, like they were dissolving into the air. By the time they should have reached the trees, they were gone. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, trying to process what I'd just seen. My wife was silent beside me. From the back seat, our daughter asked, "Daddy, what was that big hairy man?" I didn't have an answer then. I still don't. We drove home in near silence. That night, after the kids were in bed, my wife and I talked about it. We decided not to tell anyone outside the family. This was the height of the Cold War. People were paranoid about Russian technology, spies, all that stuff. And anyone who claimed to see a UFO was labeled a crackpot. Add in a Bigfoot-type creature, and we'd be laughing stocks. But I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. The way that creature moved, the silent craft above it, the intelligence I felt when it looked at me. I've spent hours in libraries reading everything I could find about Bigfoot sightings and UFO encounters, looking for similar reports. There are a few, not many, but enough to make me think I'm not alone in what I saw. The thing that bothers me most, even now, is the relationship between the creature and the craft. They move together, in sync. Was the craft following the creature, guiding it? Or were they somehow connected in a way I couldn't understand? And why did it look at me like that? There was recognition there, an assessment. I wasn't just another animal to it. It saw me, really saw me. I went back to that field a week later, alone. I walked the path where I thought the creature had gone. There was nothing, no footprints, no disturbed grass, no sign it had ever been there. I searched the tree line too, looking for any evidence, but found nothing. Over the years, I've driven past that spot many times. I always slow down, always look. I've never seen anything again, but sometimes, when I'm out in open country, I get this feeling of being watched. I find myself looking up, half expecting to see that oval craft, or looking to the trees, wondering if something large is standing just inside the shadows, watching me with that same intelligent gaze. I'm not asking anyone to believe me. I know how it sounds, but I know what I saw. My wife saw it too, though we rarely talk about it anymore. Sometimes I wonder if the kids remember. They were young, and kids often forget things, or transform them into something else in their minds. But I remember. Every detail, the way the morning light hit the dark hair on its body, the absolute silence of that craft, the way it looked at me, not with aggression, not with fear, but with awareness. I've never reported this officially, never talked to authorities or UFO investigators or cryptozoologist folks, but I know what I saw that day outside Great Falls. And sometimes I still dream about it, that face, that craft, and that moment when both simply faded away before my eyes, leaving me with questions I'll probably never have answers to. I'm curious if anyone else has had an experience like this, something that connects these two phenomena that most people consider separate mysteries. Because ever since that February morning in '76, I've been convinced there's a connection we're missing. And sometimes, late at night, I wonder if they're still out there, that strange pair moving across some empty field while the world speeds by, not noticing. Story 6. I've never really shared this with anyone outside my family. It's not the kind of thing you bring up in casual conversation without sounding completely insane. But after reading some of your experiences here, I finally feel like maybe someone will understand what my family and I went through. I grew up in St. Clair County, Alabama, in a house that backed up to hundreds of acres of dense forest. As kids, exploring those woods was our main source of entertainment. My siblings and I would spend entire days building forts, climbing trees, and wandering the winding game trails. Our Belgian shepherd always came with us, like our personal security system. That dog was fearless with one exception. There were certain spots in the woods where he'd plant his feet and refuse to go any further, no matter how much we called or coaxed. At the time, I just thought he was being stubborn. Looking back, I should have paid more attention to what he was trying to tell us. As I got older, my siblings lost interest in forest adventures, but I never did. By my teens, I was heading out alone with our Australian shepherd, Molly. She was smart as a whip and took her herding job seriously, even though we didn't have any sheep. The woods had always felt like a second home to me, but something started to change. I'd be walking along, Molly trotting happily beside me, when suddenly she'd freeze, her ears would prick forward, and the hair along her spine would stand up. Then she'd circle behind me, nudging at my legs, trying to herd me back toward the house. If I ignored her warnings and kept going, she'd whine and bark. Not her normal playful bark, but something desperate and afraid. And then there were the footsteps. I'd be hiking up near the ridge to the southwest of our property, and I'd hear them, footfalls that seemed to mirror mine, stopping when I stopped, continuing when I moved. At first, I convinced myself it was just an echo, but the timing was too perfect, too deliberate. Something was tracking me, keeping pace but staying just out of sight. Sometimes I'd catch movement from the corner of my eye. Something large shifting between the trees or ducking behind a ridge. But when I'd turn to look directly, there was never anything there, just stillness and silence, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. After a few of these incidents, I mentioned it to my mom. I expected her to laugh it off, but she didn't. Instead, her face went serious in a way that made my stomach drop. She insisted that from then on, I had to take either the shotgun or her revolver whenever I went into the woods alone. My mom wasn't the paranoid type, so her reaction scared me more than anything I'd experienced in the forest. Life moved on. I grew up, got married, had kids of my own. For a while, those strange experiences faded into the background, just weird childhood memories that I mostly convinced myself I'd imagined. Then, in 2010, my marriage fell apart. With nowhere else to go, my children and I moved back in with my parents, into my childhood home, with those same woods looming behind it. I was 32 then, too old to believe in monsters in the forest, but whatever had been out there when I was young was still waiting. The first night we spent in my old room, me and my kids all piled into one bed, we heard it, a loud bang against the side of the house right outside our window. It wasn't a branch or an animal. It sounded deliberate, like something had slammed a fist against the siding. My 5-year-old daughter shot up in bed, eyes wide with fear, while my toddler son started crying. I told them it was just the house settling, but I didn't believe it myself. The next morning, I found the footprints in the yard. They were enormous, easily 3 times the size of an adult human foot, and the stride length between them was impossibly wide. No human could make prints like that, and no bear walks upright long enough to leave that kind of trail. Whatever had left those prints had been standing directly beneath our window. Over the next few weeks, things escalated. We'd hear heavy footsteps on the porch at night, wood creaking under substantial weight. Sometimes there would be scratching at the doors or windows. My parents' dog, a big German shepherd, refused to go outside after dark, cowering and whining if we tried to make him. But the most chilling moment came when my daughter said something that made my blood run cold. She was looking out her bedroom window one afternoon and casually mentioned, "The hairy-faced man was at my window again last night." When I asked her what she meant, she described a tall figure with a face covered in dark hair and eyes that looked sad. She wasn't scared when she told me this, like it was the most normal thing in the world, which somehow made it more terrifying. I started sleeping with the revolver under my pillow. My dad installed motion sensor lights all around the property. We were all on edge, jumping at every sound, avoiding looking out the windows after sunset. The forest that had once been my playground now felt like a threat, looming at our backs. One evening in late summer, I was standing near the back porch, smoking a cigarette, and placed sound recorders at various spots in the woods. They stayed for 3 days, and though they never saw anything directly, their sound equipment picked up something extraordinary. In the recordings, you could hear what sounded like voices, not human voices, but not animal either. One was clearly female, with a pattern that almost resembled speech. There was another, higher-pitched voice that might have been a younger female, and occasionally a deeper male-sounding call from further away. The FLIR cameras didn't capture any visual evidence, which the researchers said was common. These creatures, whatever they are, seem to know how to avoid detection. The strangest thing happened after the researchers left. The activity almost completely stopped. No more banging on the walls, no more footprints, no more sightings. It was like whatever had been watching us decided to back off once we started actively looking for it. My daughter stopped seeing the hairy-faced man at her window. The dogs gradually became comfortable going outside again. Life almost returned to normal. Almost. Because we all knew what we'd experienced, what we'd seen, and we knew it was still out there, somewhere in those woods, watching and waiting. I moved my family into our own place in town about 6 months later. Being closer to my job was the excuse I gave everyone. But the truth is, I couldn't stay in that house anymore, not with those woods right there and the knowledge of what lived in them. I still don't know what to make of what happened to us. Was it really a Sasquatch family? Some unknown species of primate? Or something else entirely? All I know is that something intelligent and non-human took an interest in my family, and the experience fundamentally changed how I see the world. The forest doesn't feel like home anymore. When I look at dense woods now, I can't help wondering what might be looking back at me from the shadows. Not necessarily with malice. I never felt like whatever was watching us wanted to harm us, but with a curious intelligence that shouldn't exist according to science. Sometimes I still hear those mirroring footsteps in my dreams, and I wake up convinced that something is standing just outside my window, breathing softly, waiting for me to look. But I never do. Some things once seen can't be unseen, and I've already seen enough to last a lifetime. Story 7. I never believed in Bigfoot. Not really. Sure, I'd watch those TV shows where they go tromping around in the woods with thermal cameras and laugh at how they'd get excited over every twig snap and blur in the distance. That was before last summer. Now I don't laugh anymore. I've been staying at my buddy Mike's family property in Washington State for the past few months. It's this beautiful piece of land, about 40 acres of mixed farmland that butts up against deep forest. Mike's parents inherited it from his grandparents, but they live in Seattle now, so they let me stay in the old farmhouse while I'm between jobs. In exchange, I keep an eye on things and do basic maintenance. It's peaceful out here. At least it was. That day started like any other. It was late August, one of those perfect Pacific Northwest summer evenings where the air starts cooling down, but the sun's still warm on your skin. I'd been tracking some deer that had been coming through the property, partly out of boredom, partly because I was thinking about hunting season in a few months. Around 7 in the evening, I grabbed my binoculars and walked out to the edge of the main field. There's this perfect spot where I could sit on this old fallen log and watch the tree line. The property has this open meadow that slopes down to a small creek with a line of cottonwood trees running along it. Beyond that is a thick stand of Douglas firs that marks where the neighbor's property begins. The deer usually cross there at dusk, moving from the deep woods to graze in the field. I'd been sitting there maybe 20 minutes. The sun was getting low, creating these long shadows across the field, but there was still plenty of light. I was scanning the tree line with my binoculars when I noticed movement at the edge of the firs, maybe 300 yards away. At first, I thought it was a bear. We get black bears around here sometimes, but then it stepped fully into the clearing between the firs and cottonwoods, and I froze. This thing was walking upright, completely upright, and it was huge. I remember my hands started shaking as I tried to steady the binoculars. Through the lenses, I could see it clearly now. It was covered in dark brown fur that looked almost black in the shadows, but caught reddish highlights where the sun hit it. The fur wasn't shaggy like a bear's. It was more uniform, maybe 4 inches long all over. And the way it moved, God, the way it moved. Each stride was purposeful, deliberate. Its arms swung naturally at its sides. I've been in the woods my whole life. I know what bears look like when they stand up. This wasn't that. This thing was built to walk on two legs. Its proportions were all wrong for a bear. The shoulders too broad, the legs too long. I'm 6 foot even, and this thing had to be at least 8 feet tall, maybe taller. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I just kept watching as it scanned the area, its head turning slowly, like it was checking if the coast was clear. That's when I noticed its face. From that distance, even with decent binoculars, I couldn't make out detailed features, but it had this massive brow ridge and no visible neck. Its head just seemed to sit directly on those huge shoulders. Then it happened. As the first one reached the cottonwoods, 2 smaller figures emerged from the fir trees. They were maybe 5 to 5.5 feet tall, with lighter colored fur, more of a reddish brown. They moved quickly, almost trotting to keep up with the big one. They stayed close together, and there was something about their movements that read as young. Not children exactly, but not full-grown either. Juveniles, I guess you'd say. They kept glancing around nervously, but always staying within a few feet of each other. The way they moved hit me hard. It wasn't animal behavior I was watching. It was family behavior. Those were kids. Bigfoot kids. I know how crazy that sounds. I'd think I was crazy too if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. Before I could even process that, a 4th figure appeared from the tree line. This one was also large, though not quite as massive as the first. Maybe 7 feet tall, with the same dark brown fur. It seemed more cautious, constantly looking back toward the forest they'd come from, then checking on the smaller ones ahead of it, like it was watching their backs. They moved as a unit in formation, the biggest one in front, the 2 smaller ones in the middle, and the other large one bringing up the rear. They reached the creek, and I watched as they descended the small embankment. They were out of sight for maybe 10 seconds as they crossed the water. Then I saw them climb up the opposite bank into the field. In the open ground, I got an even better look. The lead one, I'm guessing it was the male, the father, moved with incredible confidence. Its muscle definition was visible even under the fur, especially across the shoulders and back. The 2 smaller ones stayed tight in the middle, sometimes looking up at the adults, but mainly focusing on keeping up. The rear one, probably the female, the mother, was slightly leaner, but still powerfully built. I couldn't tear my eyes away. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. This was impossible. This couldn't be happening, but it was happening, right in front of me, in broad daylight. They crossed about 100 yards of open field, moving at a steady pace. Not running, but not dawdling either, like they had somewhere specific to be and didn't want to be exposed for long. The whole crossing took maybe 2 minutes from when I first spotted them to when they disappeared into another patch of trees on the far side of the property. 2 minutes that changed everything I thought I knew. When they entered those trees on the far side, I finally let out the breath I'd been holding. My hands were shaking so bad I dropped the binoculars. I remember looking down at them in the grass and having this surreal moment where I wondered if I'd imagined the whole thing, but I hadn't. I know what I saw. I sat there for another hour as the sun went down, partly hoping they'd come back, partly terrified they would. When it got dark, I practically ran back to the farmhouse. I locked every door and window, pulled all the blinds. I didn't sleep that night, just sat in the living room with all the lights on, jumping at every creak and groan the old house made. The next morning, I hiked out to where I'd seen them cross the creek. I don't know what I expected to find. Footprints, maybe. But it had been dry for weeks, and the creek bank was mostly rocks. There was nothing obvious. No broken branches, no tufts of hair, nothing Hollywood would show as evidence. But I knew. It's been 3 months now. I haven't seen them again, though sometimes at night I think I hear strange vocalizations from the direction of the forest. Not quite howls, not quite words, something in between. I haven't told many people. Who would believe me? I can barely believe it myself, but I know what I saw. A family, a Bigfoot family, moving together across that field in the fading summer light. The adults protecting the young ones, just like any family would. The thing that sticks with me isn't the size or the fur or any of that. It's the way they move together, the clear organization and purpose, the protection, the little ones looking up at the big ones. There was intelligence there, awareness, family bonds. I still don't know what to do with this experience. I haven't reported it to any Bigfoot research groups. I haven't gone public. Part of me wants to protect them. If they're real, and I know they are, then they've managed to stay hidden for a reason. They deserve their privacy. Their family deserves to stay together. But I also can't stop thinking about them. Were they just passing through? Do they live nearby? How many more are there? Are they watching me when I'm outside the way I watched them? Sometimes when I'm out on the property now, especially near dusk, I feel eyes on me. Not threatening, just aware. And I wonder if they recognize me as clearly as I recognized them, if they know I saw them, if they're curious about the human who lives in the wooden box on their territory. I don't know if I'll ever see them again. Part of me hopes I do. Part of me hopes they stay safely hidden. But one thing's for certain, I'll never look at those Bigfoot shows the same way again. Because now I know they're real. They're families. And for 2 minutes on a summer evening, they let me see them. Story 8. I still can't explain what happened that summer in 1970 near Castle Rock. It's been over 50 years, but I remember it clearer than stuff that happened last week. I've told a few people over the years, but most think I'm making it up or exaggerating. I'm not. I know what I heard, and it wasn't anything natural. My buddy and I had been planning this camping trip for weeks. My family had this small cabin on the Tootle River that we'd use as a base camp for fishing and hunting. Nothing fancy, just a simple place with a wood stove, couple of bunks and a table. We'd been cooped up there for a few days and wanted to get deeper into the wilderness, find some place where we could really disconnect. We loaded up his old Chevy pickup that morning. 2 sleeping bags, a canvas tent that weighed a ton. Our rifles, we always brought them camping back then, a cooler with beer and sandwich stuff, and enough dry goods to last a couple days. The plan was simple. Find some remote spot in the logging area where nobody would bother us, set up camp and spend a couple days fishing and shooting targets. The weather was perfect that day, not too hot, clear skies, that fresh pine smell everywhere. We headed out from the cabin around 10 in the morning, following Spirit Lake Highway. The road was rough in spots, typical for logging country. We stopped at Chuck's store to grab more beer and some jerky. Chuck knew my family and asked where we were headed. When we told him we were looking for a spot near the logging areas, he just nodded and said to be careful because there had been some weird reports from loggers recently. Didn't elaborate, and I didn't think much of it at the time. From there, we turned onto Tower Road, crossed over the river on that old wooden bridge that used to shake when you drove over it, and continued toward the Hollywood Gorge entrance. The roads got progressively rougher as we went, turning from gravel to mostly dirt with deep ruts. My buddy's truck handled it fine, but we were getting jostled around pretty good. We eventually hit Rock Creek Road and followed it until we found this perfect spot. A wide logging landing surrounded by these massive old-growth trees. The kind of trees that make you feel small, you know? Must have been hundreds of years old, towering maybe 200 feet up. The forest was thick beyond the clearing, dark even in daylight, but the landing itself was bathed in sunlight, with tall grass growing through the gravel and wildflowers everywhere. We parked the truck at the edge of the clearing and started setting up camp around 2 in the afternoon. The sun was still high and we figured we'd have plenty of time to get everything ready, maybe even do some exploring before dark. We pitched our tent in a flat area about 30 feet from the truck, close enough to a small fire pit that previous campers had made. The whole time we were setting up, I had this weird feeling. Not exactly like we were being watched, but more like something was off. The forest was too quiet. Usually in the woods, you hear birds, small animals rustling around, but there was almost nothing. I mentioned it to my buddy, But he just shrugged it off, said the logging operations probably scared everything away. We finished setting up around 4, cracked open a couple beers, and started gathering wood for a fire. The plan was to cook some canned beans and hot dogs over the fire. Real gourmet wilderness cuisine. Everything seemed normal as the sun started to dip behind the tree line. The shadows got longer, temperature dropped a bit. Standard stuff for a summer evening in the Washington woods. Around 7:30, just as dusk was setting in, that's when it happened. The first scream hit me like a physical blow. I nearly dropped the beer I was holding. It's almost impossible to describe that sound accurately. It wasn't a cougar, wasn't a bear, wasn't an elk. I'd heard all those before. Grew up hunting with my dad in these same mountains. This was different. Higher pitched, but deeper at the same time, if that makes any sense. Like several creatures screaming together, but perfectly synchronized. It reminded me of when I'd visited the zoo in Portland and heard the chimpanzees going crazy, but much louder, much more powerful. I looked at my buddy, and his face had gone completely white. "What the hell was that?" he whispered, like he was afraid speaking normally might draw attention to us. Before I could answer, it came again. Longer this time, maybe 10 seconds of this undulating howl that echoed through the trees. It sounded like it was coming from the eastern edge of the clearing, maybe 150 feet away, where the logging landing met the old-growth forest. We both stood up slowly. The sun had just set, but there was still enough light to see. I squinted toward the tree line and felt my heart literally skip a beat. There was something there. A large, dark silhouette standing just at the edge of the trees. In the fading light, I couldn't make out details, just a black shape taller and wider than any person I'd ever seen. "You see that?" I whispered. My buddy nodded, his hand already reaching for his rifle that was propped against a nearby log. "Hey!" he shouted, suddenly startling me. "This is private property. Get out of here!" It was a ridiculous thing to say. It wasn't our property, and we both knew it was public land, but I understood the impulse. Act tough. Scare it away. The problem was, the shape didn't move, didn't even seem to react to his shout. I grabbed my own rifle, chambered a round, and fired a warning shot into the air. The crack of the 30-006 was deafening in the quiet forest, but the dark figure still didn't move. "Should we check it out?" my buddy asked, his voice unsteady. Every instinct told me to get in the truck and leave, but there was this stupid masculine pride thing happening. Two guys in their 20s armed, not wanting to look scared in front of each other. So I nodded, and we slowly walked toward the tree line, rifles ready. As we got closer, the shape became clearer in the dying light. By the time we were 30 feet away, I felt a mixture of relief and embarrassment wash over me. It was just a large tree stump, maybe 7 feet tall, with a couple of broken branches sticking out that from a distance had given it a vaguely humanoid appearance. "Jesus Christ," my buddy laughed nervously. "Got ourselves all worked up over a damn stump. We were just turning to head back to camp when it happened again. The scream. Only this time, it was louder, closer, and coming from a different direction. Somewhere deeper in the forest to our right. It lasted longer too. Maybe 45 seconds to a minute of continuous, modulating howling. It would rise and fall in pitch, sometimes sounding like it was asking a question, other times like it was in pain or rage. We froze. The sound was like nothing I'd ever heard before or since. It wasn't human, but it had an intelligence to it, a purpose. You could feel it in your gut. This wasn't just an animal calling out randomly. This was communication. And then another one answered from the opposite direction. My buddy and I didn't say a word. We just looked at each other and without speaking, turned and ran back to camp. The screams continued, echoing across the forest, seeming to come from all around us now. They couldn't have been more than 300 yards away at the furthest, probably closer. "We need to get out of here," I said, already throwing our sleeping bags into the truck. "What about the tent?" he asked, looking back at our campsite. Another scream, this one so close I could almost feel the vibration in my chest. "Leave it," I said. We jumped in the truck. My buddy turned the key and nothing, just that awful clicking sound of a starter that won't engage. He tried again. Click, click, click. "No, no, no," he muttered, turning the key frantically now. "This can't be happening." I was watching the tree line, rifle across my lap, heart pounding so hard I could hear it. The light was almost gone now, just the faintest purple glow on the horizon. The forest around us had become a wall of darkness. Another scream, definitely closer now. Then silence. We sat there in the truck, barely breathing. My buddy tried the key again, and miraculously the engine roared to life. He didn't hesitate, immediately throwing it into reverse, then spinning the wheel to turn us around toward the logging road. As we started to pull away, I looked back toward our abandoned campsite. In the sweep of the headlights, for just a split second, I thought I saw something move from the tree line into our clearing. Something large, walking on two legs, but it was so quick, so fleeting in the edge of the light, I couldn't be sure. We drove in silence for nearly 20 minutes, bouncing violently down the rutted logging road, both of us looking repeatedly in the side mirrors. Finally, when we hit the main gravel road, my buddy spoke. "What the hell was that?" he asked, his knuckles still white on the steering wheel. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "But those houses near Rock Creek are at least 2 miles from where we were. No way that was people messing with us." "Wasn't a bear, wasn't a cougar," he said. "No." "So what then?" I didn't answer. What could I say? That I thought we'd heard Bigfoot, that some unknown creature had been circling our camp, calling to others of its kind. It sounded crazy even in my head. We drove all the way back to the cabin that night. Didn't talk much about it. The next morning we went back for the tent in broad daylight. It was still there, untouched as far as we could tell. No strange footprints, no signs that anything had been in our camp. But we packed it up quickly and left. Never camped in that spot again. Over the years, I've read about other encounters in the Pacific Northwest. Some sound similar to what we experienced. I've talked to a few loggers and hunters who've heard the same kind of screams in remote areas. Most people change the subject when I bring it up, or give me that look that says they think I'm making it up. But I know what I heard that night. And sometimes, when I'm alone in the woods even now, I find myself listening for that sound again, both hoping and fearing that I'll hear it. Because whatever made those screams, it wasn't human, and it wasn't any animal I'd ever encountered before or since. I still don't have an explanation for what happened that day. Maybe I never will, but I know one thing for certain. There's something out there in those woods that science hasn't explained yet. Story 9. I still remember that day in June 2004 like it was yesterday. Time hasn't done much to dull the memory. If anything, it's gotten sharper, more defined. I've played it over and over in my head so many times, I could probably map out every second of what happened. I was fishing on the Flathead River in Montana, a spot I'd been going to since I was a kid. My dad used to take me there every summer. After he passed, I kept the tradition going as a way to feel connected to him. It was my escape, my peace, my little slice of the world that made sense when nothing else did. It was a Tuesday. I remember because I'd taken the day off work to have the river mostly to myself. The weather had been perfect, not too hot, just enough sun with these big puffy clouds drifting across the blue sky. I'd been having a decent day, caught a couple of nice trout, nothing record-breaking, but enough to make the trip worthwhile. I was about a mile upstream from Columbia Falls, standing waist-deep in the water. The current was gentle that day, tugging at my waders, but not strong enough to worry about. I'd been there maybe 3 hours, just me and the water and the rhythmic casting of my line. That's when everything changed. It's hard to describe exactly what happened first. The air just stopped. Not the wind dying down, I mean everything stopped. The constant background noise of the river seemed to dim. The birds went quiet, even the insects stopped buzzing. It was like someone had pressed mute on the whole world. I remember feeling the hair on the back of my neck stand up. You know that feeling when you're being watched? This was that, but amplified 100 times. My body knew something was wrong before my brain caught up. Then I heard the splashing, not the gentle lapping of the river against the rocks, but heavy, purposeful splashing, like something massive was moving through water. It came from upstream, around a slight bend in the river, where my view was partially blocked by some pines that grew right up to the water's edge. I turned toward the sound, thinking maybe it was a moose. We get them around there sometimes. A bull moose can be dangerous, especially during rutting season, but it was June, so I wasn't too concerned. What came around that bend wasn't a moose. I'm not a small guy, 6 foot even, 190 pounds, but what I saw made me feel tiny. It was enormous, standing at least 8.5 feet tall. Its shoulders were twice as broad as mine, its arms hanging down past where a human's knees would be, and it was covered head to toe in dark, wet hair that clung to its body as it moved through the river. The water was up to its thighs, which means it was crossing a part that would be chest deep on me, and it was moving with purpose, taking deliberate steps against the current like it was nothing more than a trickle. I froze, completely and utterly froze. My fishing rod was still in my hands, but I couldn't have moved if my life depended on it. Maybe that saved me, I don't know. Its head was massive, with this heavy brow that shadowed its eyes. Its nose was wide and flat, and its jaw was broad, giving its face this almost rectangular look. I could see steam coming from its nostrils in the cool morning air. Then it turned and looked straight at me. We were maybe 40 yards apart, close enough that I could see the intelligence in its eyes, and that's what haunts me the most to this day. Those eyes, they weren't animal eyes. They were aware, calculating. There was something behind them that knew exactly what I was and was deciding what to do about me. The smell hit me next, even across that distance, with a gentle breeze. This rank, musky odor carried across the water. It was like wet dog combined with something rotten and earthy, so strong it made my eyes water. The thing stopped in the middle of the river. It tilted its head up slightly, and I could see its nostrils flaring, taking in deep breaths. It was smelling the air, smelling me. Then it made this sound, this low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the water around me. It wasn't particularly loud, but it was deep. So deep I felt it more than heard it. It resonated in my chest cavity and shook me from the inside out. I've heard bears growl before, but this was different, lower, more intentional. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear my pulse in my ears. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I was certain, absolutely certain. I was about to die, but it didn't charge. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds, it broke eye contact and continued crossing the river. Its movements were deliberate, powerful. Each step displaced huge amounts of water. When it reached the opposite bank, it climbed out with this fluid grace that seemed impossible for something so large. Water cascaded off its body as it stood on the shore, still partially turned toward me. The sun caught it then, and I could see its hair wasn't pure black, but had these reddish-brown undertones. It stood there for maybe 5 seconds, still as a statue, before it turned and moved into the tree line. And I mean it moved into the tree line, not like it walked between trees, but like it melted into them. 1 second it was there, this massive, unmistakable shape against the green, and the next it was gone. No sound of breaking branches, no rustling leaves, just gone. I don't know how long I stood there afterward. Could have been minutes, could have been an hour. I was shaking so badly I could barely keep my footing in the current. When I finally managed to move, I nearly fell face first into the water because my legs were like jelly. I reeled in my line with fumbling fingers, dropped it twice before I got it secured to my rod. I kept looking over my shoulder, scanning the tree line on both sides of the river. The woods that had felt so familiar and comforting just hours before now seemed ominous and alien. Getting out of the water was an exercise in panic. Every splash I made seemed deafening. Every shadow among the trees looked like it was moving. When I finally reached my gear on the shore, I didn't even bother changing out of my waders. I just grabbed my tackle box and my backpack and started half jogging, half stumbling back toward where I'd parked my truck. It was maybe 3/4 of a mile through the woods to the dirt access road where my truck was. I'd made that walk countless times over the years, usually taking my time, enjoying the forest. This time, I practically ran, tripping over roots, getting slapped in the face by branches I was too panicked to avoid. The whole time, I kept feeling like it was right behind me, that at any moment, a huge hand would close around my shoulder, or that deep growl would sound right in my ear. I kept hearing noises, snapping twigs, rustling leaves, but I couldn't tell if they were real or just my imagination working overtime. When I finally broke through the tree line and saw my truck sitting there on the dirt road, I almost cried with relief. I fumbled with my keys, dropping them in the dirt twice before I could get the door unlocked. I threw my gear in the back and practically dove into the driver's seat, locking the doors immediately. Even in the truck, I didn't feel safe. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. The entire drive home, I kept checking my rear-view mirror. Every time I had to slow down for a curve, I was certain something was going to step out of the woods onto the road in front of me. By the time I got home, I was drenched in sweat. My throat was raw from breathing so hard, and I had a splitting headache from the tension. I sat in my driveway for 15 minutes, just trying to calm down enough to go inside. That night was the worst. Every creak in the house, every shadow, every gust of wind against the windows had me jumping. I didn't sleep at all. I just sat in my living room with all the lights on, a kitchen knife on the coffee table in front of me, staring at the locks on my doors and windows. I've spent the 20 years since trying to make sense of what I saw. I've looked up every animal native to Montana. I've read about bears standing on their hind legs, not even close to what I saw. I've gone down rabbit holes about escaped zoo animals and government experiments. I've even reluctantly researched Bigfoot sightings in the area. Some people I've told have suggested it was just a bear, that fear distorted my perception. Others have outright said I'm lying or was hallucinating. A few have believed me but offered no explanations. One guy, after several beers, told me about his uncle who had seen something similar near Glacier National Park in the 70s. Whatever it was, the encounter changed me. I used to love being out in nature alone. Now I get anxious if I can't see a clear path back to civilization. I've never gone fishing by myself again, and I've never, not once, gone back to that stretch of the Flathead River. I drive an extra 30 miles to fish a different section when I take my kids now. The thing that keeps me up at night isn't just what I saw, but the way it looked at me. That wasn't just an animal reacting to a human in its territory. Those eyes, there was recognition there, intelligence, purpose. Whatever was crossing that river that day, it saw me, it knew me, and sometimes in my darkest moments, I'm convinced it's still out there, remembering me too. Story 10. I still remember how the hot air wrapped around us that August morning back in '79. 8 of us kids had decided to explore the Bird Peninsula at Flagler Beach on Florida's east coast. Looking back now, I can't believe how carefree we were, splashing through the shallow water, our sneakers getting soaked because none of us bothered to take them off. We didn't care. It was summer, we were free, and that little stretch of land was our kingdom for the day. The peninsula wasn't anything special to most people, just a sandy stretch that jutted out into the water, surrounded by tall marsh grass that rustled in the breeze. But to us, it was perfect. Birds nested there, undisturbed most of the time, which made it feel like our own little discovery. We'd gone there to collect feathers, look for cool shells, and just get away from our parents for a few hours. Joey, the oldest among us at 14, led our little expedition as usual. I was 12 then, along with my buddy Mark. The others ranged from 11 down to Joey's little sister Angie, who was only 9, but insisted on coming everywhere her brother went. We'd been out there for maybe an hour, the sun climbing higher, making the back of my neck prickle with sweat. I remember taking off my baseball cap and wiping my forehead with my arm when I first got that feeling. You know the one. Like when someone's staring at you in class and you just know it before you even turn around to catch them. Except this wasn't school, and whatever was watching us wasn't another kid. You guys feel that? I asked, putting my cap back on and turning in a slow circle. Mark looked up from the crab shell he was examining. Feel what? Like something watching. Joey stood up straight from where he'd been crouched near the water's edge. Don't be a wuss, he said, but I noticed how his eyes scanned the shoreline around us. That's when I turned toward the mainland, looking across the water at the small hill about 200 yards away. It was one of the only elevated spots in the whole area. Most of Flagler was flat as a pancake. The hill wasn't big, maybe 20 feet high, but it stuck out against the sky like a lone tooth. At first I thought I was seeing a tree stump at the top. We'd had a bad storm the previous month that knocked down some of the older trees in the area, but then it moved. The stump shifted position, and I realized it was way bigger than I'd first thought. My stomach did this weird flip, like missing a step going downstairs in the dark. Guys, I said, my voice coming out all croaky, look at the hill, there's something there. One by one, they all turned to look. The thing had started to move down the hillside, and that's when I realized how tall it was, much taller than any person I knew. Its movements were smooth but deliberate, like it was trying to be careful coming down the slope. What is that? Angie asked, her voice small. Before I could answer, before anyone could say a single word, Joey suddenly bolted. He just took off running across the peninsula toward the shallowest part where we'd crossed over. Then Mark went, then the others. This weird chain reaction of panic without a single scream or shout. I stood frozen for maybe 2 seconds longer, watching as the figure continued down the hill, before my legs finally got the message from my brain, and I ran too. I've never run so hard in my life. The wet sand sucked at my sneakers, and I stumbled twice, scraping my knee the second time. I didn't stop to check if it was bleeding. I just scrambled back up and kept going. We didn't stop running until we reached Joey's garage about a mile from the beach. All of us were gasping, doubled over with our hands on our knees. My lungs felt like they were on fire, and my wet shoes had rubbed blisters on both heels. What the hell was that? Mark finally managed between breaths. Joey shook his head, still panting. Don't know. Why'd you all run? I asked, feeling a weird mix of fear and irritation. Nobody said anything. You all just took off. They looked at each other with wide eyes, and Angie started crying softly. It moved its head, Joey finally said. When you told us to look, it was watching us, and then it turned its head, like it was, I don't know, studying us or something. I saw it too. Another kid named Danny nodded. It was like it realized we spotted it. We spent the next hour in Joey's garage, drinking warm Kool-Aid and trying to make sense of what we'd seen. The more we talked, the clearer the image became in my mind. What I'd seen wasn't just some weirdly shaped stump. It was a figure, tall and massive, covered in long hair that looked brown with streaks of gray running through it. It had walked upright on 2 legs, with a silhouette that was unmistakably human-like, but with a much larger, broader frame. It wasn't a bear, Mark insisted, and we all agreed. Florida bears are stocky and dark, and they often drop to all fours when moving quickly. Plus, bears don't typically just stand around watching people. This thing had been deliberately observing us. Maybe it was just some guy, Angie suggested hopefully, wiping the last of her tears away. Joey shook his head. No way! It was way too big to be a person. And did you see all that hair? It wasn't clothes. It was like fur or something, but not like any animal I've ever seen. I remembered how coarse the hair had looked, even from that distance. Not soft like a dog's fur or a raccoon's coat, more like those stiff bristles on a scrub brush, but longer. The memory sent a shiver down my spine, despite the garage being at least 90 degrees. "What about a costume?" Danny offered. "Like someone playing a prank." We considered this for a moment, but it didn't make sense. Who would wear a full-body hairy costume in August in Florida? The heat would be unbearable, and why would they be out there in that specific location? The peninsula wasn't easy to get to. You had to know about the shallow crossing points to reach it without a boat. And the hill, where the thing had been standing, was even more isolated, surrounded by marshy wetland that was a pain to navigate. "You think it was you know," Mark finally said, lowering his voice like someone might be listening. "A Bigfoot or something?" A few kids snickered nervously, but nobody outright dismissed it. We'd all seen those cheesy "In Search Of" episodes about Bigfoot and other mysteries, but those were supposed to be in the Pacific Northwest, in forests and mountains, not on the flat coast of Florida. "My uncle says there's skunk apes in the Everglades," Joey said thoughtfully. "They're like Florida's version of Bigfoot. He claims he saw one when he was fishing down south a few years back." "That's hundreds of miles away," I pointed out. "And the Everglades are nothing like Flagler." But the more we talked, the more I kept coming back to what I'd seen. The way it moved, deliberate but fluid. The massive size compared to the surrounding landscape. How it had been standing there, watching us before we even noticed it. "We should go back tomorrow," Joey suddenly announced. "But bring my dad's binoculars and maybe his camera." The protest was immediate and unanimous. None of us wanted to go back there. Not tomorrow, not ever. Something about the way that thing had looked at us, like it knew exactly what we were and was deciding what to do about it, had shaken us all deeply. We made a pact that day not to tell our parents. They'd either think we were making it up for attention, or worse, they'd believe us and forbid us from going to the peninsula again. And while none of us wanted to encounter that thing again, the peninsula was still our special place. We weren't ready to give it up entirely, but none of us went back there for the rest of that summer. When school started in September, our adventure at the peninsula became just another summer story, tucked away with all the others. Except I couldn't forget it. I'd lie awake at night, replaying the scene in my mind. The strange feeling of being watched, the figure on the hill, the way it moved. Sometimes in my dreams, it would be coming toward us across the water, its long strides eating up the distance between us. Those eyes I never actually saw clearly, fixed on me. About 3 weeks after school started, I finally worked up the courage to bike out to Flagler Beach alone. I didn't go to the peninsula. I wasn't that brave or that stupid. Instead, I found a spot where I could see it from a distance, and I just sat there watching for nearly 2 hours. Part of me hoped to see the figure again, to confirm that I hadn't imagined it. Another part desperately hoped I wouldn't. I saw nothing that day, except birds and the occasional fish jumping. But as I was getting ready to leave, an old man who'd been fishing nearby struck up a conversation. "You've been staring at that peninsula for a while now, son. Something interesting over there." I hesitated, then shrugged, just like watching the birds. He nodded slowly, reeling in his line to check the bait. "That's a special place, that peninsula. Been here all my life, and there's always been stories about it." My heart skipped a beat. "What kind of stories?" He cast his line back out into the water with practiced ease. "Oh, you know how people talk. Some say they've seen things out there that can't be explained, particularly around that hill across the way." I followed his gaze to the hill where we'd spotted the figure. "What kind of things?" The old man shrugged. "Different things to different people, I reckon. My daddy used to tell me about a tall creature that would watch from that hill. Said it had been there since before the first settlers came." He chuckled. Course, that could just be old fish tales. Fishermen are known for exaggerating. I wanted to tell him then, about what we'd seen, about how we'd all run without a word, about the feeling that had settled deep in my bones that we'd been sized up by something that didn't belong in our normal world. But I kept quiet. As I biked home, I couldn't shake the thought that whatever we saw that day wasn't just passing through. It lived there. It was territorial, and it had been watching that peninsula, its peninsula, long before we started playing there. I'm 45 years old now, and I've never gone back to that specific spot at Flagler Beach. I've told myself 1,000 different explanations for what we saw that day. A weirdly shaped shadow, an unusually tall person, a weather-beaten tree that the wind made appear to move. But deep down, I know what I saw, what we all saw. Sometimes I think about contacting Joey or Mark or one of the others to talk about it again, to see if they remember it the same way I do, or if time has changed their memories. But I never do. Some experiences are better left in the past, but I still get that feeling sometimes, that unmistakable sensation of being watched, and when I do, I'm instantly transported back to that hot August morning, standing on that sandy peninsula, looking up at a hill where something impossible stood watching 8 kids who had unknowingly wandered into its territory, and I wonder if it's still there, watching others who venture too close to its domain. I don't know what it was. I can't explain it. All I know is that there was something on that hill that day, something tall and hairy and distinctly not human. And it was watching us. And some part of me knows, with absolute certainty, that it's still there. Story 11. I still get goosebumps thinking about it. It was August 77, a warm night on the Missouri River below Hauser Dam. Anyone who fishes knows how time can slip away when you're in the zone, and I'd stayed out way longer than planned. The rainbow trout were hitting well that evening. I had 4 nice ones, about 3 pounds each, keeping cool in a little rock circle I'd made at the water's edge. By 11 that night it was pitch black, no moon at all. You couldn't see more than a few feet ahead without a light. I'm talking the kind of darkness where you can barely make out your hand in front of your face. But I know that stretch of river like the back of my hand, so I wasn't worried about navigating back to my truck. I had my gear set up on this big flat boulder, my fly box, some extra leader, and this heavy-duty mag light I always brought for night fishing. It was one of those serious flashlights, the kind cops carry, not some dinky little thing. But I wasn't using it much, trying to preserve the batteries and honestly just enjoying the solitude of the darkness. I'd wandered about 20 yards upstream, working this promising eddy, when I realized I'd lost my fly. Must have snagged it on something underwater, so I turned to head back to my boulder to tie on a new one. That's when things started to get weird. As I approached my little setup, I noticed some movement near the boulder. At first, I figured it was probably a raccoon, or maybe even a deer coming down for a drink. That's not uncommon around there. But something felt different. The movement seemed too substantial, too deliberate. But in that darkness, I couldn't make out what it was. My heart started beating a bit faster as I got closer, not out of fear exactly, more like that heightened awareness you get when you sense something's not quite right. I reached the boulder, fumbling for my flashlight. I clicked it on, initially pointing it up the steep embankment towards some brush where I thought I'd heard rustling. The beam cut through the darkness, and immediately I heard crackling, like something big moving through the underbrush. I swung the light directly toward the sound, and that's when I saw it. I'm not prone to exaggeration. I've been an outdoorsman all my life, hunted everything from squirrels to elk, and I know the wildlife in Montana. What I saw wasn't anything I recognized. Not 10 feet away, moving rapidly up the bank diagonally away from me, was this creature. It was massive, easily 8 feet tall, maybe more, broad-shouldered, powerfully built, covered in long, dark hair or fur. It wasn't a bear. I've seen plenty of those. This thing moved upright on 2 legs, with a stride and gait that was eerily human-like, but not. Its arms swung at its sides like a person walking quickly, but there was this raw power in its movement that was nothing like a human. Each step covered ground like it was nothing, even though it was climbing over boulders and up a steep embankment. I never saw its face. It was already moving away when my light hit it, like it had heard or sensed me coming and was making its escape. The beam only caught it for a few seconds before it disappeared into the darkness beyond the reach of my flashlight. The weirdest part. In that moment, I wasn't actually scared. Shocked, absolutely confused, definitely, but not terrified. It felt like I'd surprised it as much as it surprised me, and it was just an animal trying to get away. It didn't make any threatening moves or sounds, just bolted. I stood there for what felt like forever, flashlight beam still pointed at where it had vanished, half expecting it to come back. My hand was shaking a bit, making the light beam dance around the embankment. The silence after it left was intense, just the sound of the river behind me and my own breathing. When I finally got my wits about me, I looked down at my rock pool, where I'd kept my catch. That's when the situation changed for me. 2 of my 4 trout were gone. Just gone. The rock circle was undisturbed, but half my catch had vanished. That explained the movement I'd noticed as I was approaching. This thing had been helping itself to my fish when I interrupted its meal. I felt a chill run down my spine at that point. It had been right there within arm's reach of my gear, maybe just moments before I got back. Suddenly, from somewhere downstream, I heard what sounded like a boulder crashing down the embankment and into the water. It was distant, maybe a quarter mile away, but in the dead silence of that moonless night, the sound carried clearly. Whatever this thing was, it was moving away fast, dislodging rocks as it went. I don't mind admitting that's when I started to feel genuinely uneasy. The encounter itself had been so brief and unexpected that I hadn't processed it fully. But standing there alone in the darkness, with the realization that this creature had been close enough to take my fish without me knowing, and was still out there somewhere, yeah, that got to me. I gathered up my remaining 2 trout and my gear quickly. Not bothering to properly pack everything away like I normally would, I just stuffed it all in my fishing vest and tackle box, grabbed my rod, and started making my way back to where I'd parked. The walk back felt like it took forever. Every snap of a twig or rustle in the brush had me swinging my flashlight around, half expecting to see those massive shoulders and that hair again. But there was nothing. When I got back to my truck, I threw everything in the back and sat in the driver's seat for a few minutes, just trying to make sense of what I'd seen. I'm not someone who believes in monsters or myths, but I know what I saw wasn't a bear, wasn't a moose, wasn't anything I could identify. That night at home, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying those few seconds in my head, the size of it, the way it moved, how fast it scaled that embankment. I've seen Olympic athletes who couldn't move like that, especially not on that kind of terrain in complete darkness. The next morning, I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it or somehow exaggerated it in my mind. But those missing fish weren't imaginary. Something had taken them and something had been there. I went back to that same spot a few days later, in broad daylight this time. I wanted to see the embankment again, maybe look for tracks or signs. The bank was about a 30-degree slope, covered in loose rock and scrub brush, rising about 50 feet from the river to the tree line. It would be challenging for a person to climb quickly, especially in the dark. Whatever I saw had gone up it like it was nothing. I didn't find much. Some disturbed ground, a few rocks that looked like they'd been recently dislodged. Nothing conclusive. But standing there in the daylight, looking at the distance and the terrain, I became even more certain that what I'd seen wasn't normal. I've told this story to a few close friends over the years. Some laugh it off. Some get that look like they're not sure if I'm pulling their leg. A couple have shared their own strange experiences in the backcountry. One guy, an old-timer who spent his whole life in those mountains, just nodded and said, The Blackfeet have stories about them. They call them the hairy ones. I've read about similar encounters since then. Some people call it Bigfoot or Sasquatch. I don't know what to call it. I just know what I saw, and it wasn't something that's supposed to exist according to science. I've gone back to that stretch of the Missouri many times over the years. It's still one of my favorite fishing spots, but I don't stay after dark anymore, and I always keep my catch a little closer. 46 years have passed since that August night, and I've never seen anything like it again. But sometimes, when I'm out in the woods alone and the sun starts to set, I get this feeling of being watched. It's probably just my imagination, memories of that night playing tricks on me, but maybe, just maybe, it's out there still, watching from the tree line, waiting for the darkness. I don't know what it was, and I don't have any grand theories about undiscovered primates or anything like that. All I know is what I saw, 8 feet tall, covered in hair, moving with unbelievable speed and strength. And sometimes, that's all you get. A brief glimpse of something unexplainable that leaves you wondering for the rest of your life. Story 12. I've been sitting on this experience for years now, trying to make sense of what I saw. I'm not someone who jumps to conclusions or sees things that aren't there. I'm a rational person who loves the outdoors and has spent countless hours in forests across the country. But what happened that day in January 2018 shook me to my core, and I still can't explain it away, no matter how hard I try. It was the second weekend of January. I remember because I'd been planning this solo winter hike for weeks, waiting for the perfect conditions. The forecast called for clear skies, following a heavy snowfall earlier that week. Perfect for snowshoeing and photography, my 2 winter passions. I arrived at Allegheny National Forest around 7 in the morning. The temperature gauge in my truck read 18 degrees, and I could see my breath hanging in the air as I geared up. There was easily over a foot of snow blanketing everything, the kind of pristine, untouched white that makes you almost hesitant to disturb it. I strapped on my snowshoes, adjusted my pack with extra layers, snacks, water and emergency gear, and slung my camera around my neck. I'd planned a roughly 8-mile loop that would take me deep into the forest and back before sunset. The first few hours were exactly what I'd hoped for. Peaceful, serene, with that special stillness that only comes with a snow-covered forest. The only sounds were the soft crunch of my snowshoes and my own breathing. I spotted a few chickadees and nuthatches, snapped some photos of frost patterns on tree bark, and felt that familiar contentment that comes from being alone in nature. Around midday, I reached the bottom of this bowl-shaped hollow. The sun was high enough to cast some warmth, so I decided to take a break. I found a fallen log that wasn't completely buried in snow, brushed it off, and sat down to have some trail mix and water. That's when I first noticed something odd across the clearing. From where I sat, I had a clear view of the opposite slope, maybe 200 yards away. What caught my eye were unusual marks in the snow, wide, deep grooves that cut straight across the pristine white surface from the tree line. At first, I thought maybe it was from a local dragging a sled or some equipment, but it didn't make sense. The trail came straight down a steep section that would be difficult for anyone to navigate, and there were no human tracks alongside it. Curiosity got the better of me. I pulled out my binoculars to get a better look at these strange drag marks. As I was focusing the lenses, movement at the edge of the tree line caught my eye. Something was emerging from the shadows of the dense pines. My brain couldn't process what my eyes were seeing. My first thought was, that can't be a person. It's too big. Then I thought maybe it was someone wearing bulky winter gear, but the proportions were all wrong. Whatever this was, it was walking upright on 2 legs, moving with surprising grace for its size, and it was dragging something. I adjusted my binoculars, my hands suddenly shaking. The focus sharpened, and I felt a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. The figure was enormous, towering well above the surrounding brush. It was dragging what I now realized was a deer carcass, holding one of the hind legs in its hand. A full-grown white-tailed deer being pulled through the snow like it weighed nothing. The deer was clearly dead, limp, with dark stains around its neck that I recognized as blood. I remember thinking, this isn't real. This can't be real. But I was looking right at it. The creature was massive. It was covered in dark hair, a deep brown that looked almost black in the shadows. The hair was long and shaggy, especially around the shoulders. Its build made even the largest human look small in comparison. The shoulders were incredibly wide, and its arms hung lower than a person's would, ending in what looked like enormous hands. I'd guess it stood at least 8 feet tall, maybe more. The way it moved was what struck me most. Each step was deliberate but fluid, not awkward or lumbering like you might expect from something so large. It moved with purpose, leaving deep imprints in the snow with every footfall. I remained frozen on that log, barely breathing, afraid even the slightest movement would draw its attention. At one point, it stopped and adjusted its grip on the deer. That's when I got the clearest view of its profile. The head was proportionally large, with a sloping forehead that seemed to blend right into those massive shoulders, like it had little to no neck at all. I could partially see its face, framed by all that thick hair. It had what looked like a broad, flat nose and a pronounced brow ridge. What struck me was how effortlessly it handled the deer. A white-tailed buck can easily weigh 150 to 200 pounds, but this thing was dragging it with one hand like it was nothing more than a grocery bag. Then something happened that made my blood run cold. The creature suddenly stopped. It lifted its head and began scanning the clearing, slowly turning in place. I felt absolutely certain it had somehow sensed my presence. I was downwind, and I hadn't made a sound, but somehow it knew it wasn't alone. I pressed myself against the log, trying to become invisible, my heart pounding so hard I was sure it would give me away. The creature remained still for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds. Then it made a sound, a low, resonant grunt, unlike anything I've ever heard. Not a bear, not an elk, not anything I could identify from years of being in the woods. It was deep and powerful enough that I almost felt it more than heard it. After that, it simply resumed dragging the deer, continuing toward the denser timber on the far side of the clearing. I watched, hardly daring to breathe, as it disappeared back into the shadows of the forest. I stayed frozen in place for at least 20 minutes after it vanished, afraid to move, afraid it might come back. Eventually, the cold started seeping through my layers, forcing me to make a decision. The rational part of my brain was screaming at me to turn around and head straight back to my truck. But there was another part, the part that needed proof, that needed to know I hadn't hallucinated the whole thing. I stood up on shaky legs and cautiously made my way across the clearing toward the drag marks. I kept scanning the tree line, ready to bolt at the slightest movement. When I reached the trail in the snow, I just stood there staring down at evidence I couldn't deny. The drag mark from the deer was exactly what you'd expect. A long, continuous groove in the snow with occasional spots of blood. But beside it were the footprints, and they defied explanation. They were unmistakably foot-shaped, not the round prints of a bear or the cloven hooves of an elk. They were human-like, but massive. I'd guess each print was around 17 inches long. I wear a size 11 boot, and these dwarfed my footprints like an adult's next to a child's. I knelt down to examine them more closely. The impressions were deep, much deeper than my own tracks, despite my pack and gear. Whatever made these prints was incredibly heavy, and the stride length was astounding, easily over 4 feet between prints. No human could match that, especially in deep snow. I took out my camera with trembling hands and snapped several photos of the prints and drag marks. I even placed my water bottle next to one print for scale. Looking back, I wish I'd taken more. but in that moment, I was operating on pure adrenaline. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, and a primal fear was building inside me. I didn't want to be in these woods after dark. Not anymore. Not knowing what else shared them with me. I followed the tracks just far enough to see they continued into the denser forest, then turned and made my way back to the trail as quickly as my snowshoes would allow. The hike back to my truck was a blur. I kept looking over my shoulder, jumping at every sound. The forest that had seemed so peaceful that morning now felt threatening. I made it back just as dusk was settling, threw my gear in the truck, and sat there for a long time with the engine running and the heater on full blast, trying to process what I'd seen. That was 5 years ago. I've gone over it countless times in my mind, trying to find some rational explanation. A man in a costume. Impossible. No costume could mimic those proportions or that strength. A bear? Bears don't walk upright for that distance or drag prey that way. Some other known animal? Nothing fits. I've shown the photos to a few trusted friends. The footprints are clear, but without the creature itself in frame, they're just big, strange impressions in snow. People either think I'm exaggerating or misinterpreting what I saw. I've stopped sharing the story for the most part. The encounter changed me. I still hike and camp, but never alone anymore, and I'm constantly aware of my surroundings in a way I never was before. Sometimes I catch myself scanning the tree line, looking for movement, listening for that distinctive grunt. I jump at shadows and sounds that never bothered me in the past. I know what I saw that day, a creature that shouldn't exist but does, a Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever you want to call it, living in the forests of Pennsylvania. It was real, it was massive, and it was powerful enough to kill and drag a full-grown deer through deep snow with apparent ease. I've read all the scientific arguments against their existence. No bodies found, no conclusive evidence. But science hasn't spent a January afternoon watching one drag its prey through the snow. I have, and I'll never forget it. Story 13. I've spent most of my life in the Cowichan Valley and never really bought into the whole Sasquatch thing. I'd hear stories at bonfires, laugh them off, and go about my business. That was until about 4 years ago, when a bunch of weird stuff started happening that I still can't explain. It started on a camping trip with my buddies in the backcountry. We had this sweet little spot by a stream, far enough from any trails that we wouldn't be bothered. The first night was normal, drinking beers, cooking hot dogs, telling stupid stories around the campfire. Nothing unusual. The second night is when things got weird. We'd all gone to sleep in our tents when I woke up to what sounded like something moving around our campsite, not like a raccoon or small animal. This was heavier, more deliberate. The footsteps were quiet, but you could feel them. That slight vibration in the ground when something big is walking nearby. I froze in my sleeping bag. At first, I thought maybe it was one of the guys taking a leak, but then I realized everyone was still in their tents. I could hear them breathing. Whatever was out there was not one of us. I slowly unzipped my tent just enough to peek out. The fire had died down to embers, but there was still enough light to see the clearing. That's when I saw it. Just for a second. A large, upright figure standing at the edge of our campsite. It was massive. Not like bear on hind legs massive, but something else entirely. The proportions were all wrong for a bear. Too tall, too human-like, but definitely not human. Before I could process what I was seeing, a dirt bike roared somewhere in the distance. Probably some kid joyriding on the logging roads. The figure bolted. Bolted. 1 second it was there, and the next it was gone. No crashing through the underbrush, no heavy footfalls, it just disappeared into the trees, silently. How does something that big move that quietly? I didn't wake the others. What was I going to say? Hey guys, I think Bigfoot was checking us out. They'd think I was drunk or dreaming. I barely believed it myself, but I didn't sleep another wink that night. When morning came, I casually asked if anyone else had heard anything strange during the night. No one had. I decided to keep what I saw to myself. We packed up and headed home the next day, and I tried to forget about it. About 2 weeks later, my friend Mike called me up. He was shaken. He'd been driving back from Lake Cowichan on that same forestry road near where we'd camped. It was dusk, and something darted across the road in front of his truck. He said it was so fast, he barely had time to hit the brakes. He described watching this massive dark figure use a tree at the roadside like a gymnast uses a springboard. It grabbed the trunk and literally launched itself over the fence on the other side of the road. Mike turned around and went back to the spot the next morning. The tree, a decent-sized Douglas fir, maybe 8 inches in diameter, was partially uprooted and leaning. Whatever had used it to vault the fence had nearly pulled it out of the ground. That's when I told him what I'd seen at our campsite. We both got chills. Then things started to snowball. Another buddy, Chris, told us how he and his girlfriend had been sleeping in the back of his truck while camping in the same general area. They'd woken up in the middle of the night to his dog growling, not barking, just this low, terrified growl. His girlfriend looked out the window and saw what she described as a large, dark shape watching them from the tree line. She said it paced back and forth for almost an hour before disappearing. The dog wouldn't stop trembling until morning. I started paying more attention when we were out in the woods, reading up on Sasquatch encounters, looking for signs, and then it happened again. We were back in the same area, different campsite, but same general part of the valley. Late evening, we were sitting around the fire when someone suggested we try calling out into the forest. I felt stupid, but we started making noises. Whistles, whoops, grunts, clicking sounds, just goofing around really. Then we got a response. From somewhere in the darkness beyond our firelight, something mimicked our sounds. A whoop answered our whoop, a whistle for a whistle. It wasn't an echo. It wasn't another group of campers. We were miles from any other sight. We fell silent, staring at each other wide-eyed. Then one of the guys grabbed a stick and tapped it against a tree trunk. Tap, tap, tap. Silence for about 10 seconds. Then from the darkness, tap, tap, tap. I felt the hair on my arms stand up. This wasn't some animal. Whatever was out there was deliberately communicating with us. We kept it up for maybe 15 minutes, exchanging these signals, before it eventually stopped responding. We were pretty freaked out, but also exhilarated. We'd made contact with something. About a month later, 4 of us went back. This time, we were determined to try again. We set up camp and waited until dark. Once again, we started with our whistles and whoops. Nothing at first. Then we heard it, a large branch striking a tree in a distinct pattern, 2 or 3 taps, spaced about 5 seconds apart. This continued for maybe 30 seconds. We responded with whoops and heard a couple more taps before silence fell. Complete silence. Even the normal forest sounds, the crickets, frogs, owls, everything went quiet. It was like the whole forest was holding its breath. None of us slept well that night. We kept the fire going until dawn, speaking in hushed voices, jumping at every snap of a twig. Nothing else happened, but the feeling of being watched never left. Another time, we were hanging out by the river on a hot afternoon. No one else around for miles. Suddenly, we heard what sounded exactly like a hammer striking a nail. Loud, sharp, rhythmic knocks. They came in sets of 3, spaced out over about half an hour, but there was no construction. No other humans anywhere nearby. Just us, the river, and whatever was making those sounds. The incident that really sealed it for me happened last summer. We were camping again, different spot but still in the valley, middle of the night, dead silent except for the usual forest sounds. Then we heard it, faint but unmistakable whooping calls echoing through the trees. 3 distinct calls, each one sending chills down my spine. They weren't coyotes or owls or any animal I've ever heard in these woods, and I've spent my whole life here. What freaks me out most is how coordinated these things seem to be. They're not just wandering around making random noises, they're communicating with each other and somehow with us. They're watching, observing, maybe even trying to figure us out the same way we're trying to figure them out. I've looked into other reports from the area since all this started. Turns out the Cowichan Valley has a long history of similar encounters. The local First Nations have stories going back generations about wild men of the woods. Loggers talk about finding massive footprints in remote cut blocks. Hikers describe feeling watched or finding strange structures of branches that don't look natural. The weird thing is, I never felt threatened during any of these encounters. Scared, sure. Awestruck, definitely, but never in danger. Whatever these things are, they seem more curious than aggressive. They could have approached our campsite any time if they wanted to, but they always kept their distance. I'm still camping in those woods. I still hike those trails, but I don't go alone anymore, and I'm a lot more aware of my surroundings. I listen more carefully to the sounds of the forest. I look more closely at the shadows between the trees. Sometimes, especially at dusk when the light is fading, I'll catch movement out of the corner of my eye, something large moving quickly through the trees. By the time I turn to look, it's gone. But I know what I saw that night by the firelight. I know what Mike saw across that road. I know what we heard calling back to us from the darkness. There's something out there in the Cowichan Valley. Something that walks upright but isn't human. Something intelligent enough to communicate, fast enough to vanish in an instant, and strong enough to nearly uproot a tree. I don't know what to call it. Sasquatch, Bigfoot, wild man. But I know it's real. And I know we've only caught the briefest glimpses of them. I've tried telling people about these experiences. Most think I'm making it up or misinterpreting normal forest sounds and shadows. That's fine. I probably wouldn't believe it either if I hadn't experienced it firsthand. But for those who've had their own encounters, who've felt that bone-deep certainty that you're not alone in the woods, they get it. They know. Just last week, I was hiking alone. I know I said I don't do that anymore, but it was midday on a popular trail. I stopped to rest on a fallen log, and that's when I noticed the silence. That unnatural quiet that seems to precede these encounters. I sat perfectly still, barely breathing, and waited. Nothing happened, but that feeling of being observed was overwhelming. I finally stood up, said, "I know you're there," out loud, and continued down the trail. As I walked away, I heard 3 distinct knocks from the forest behind me. I didn't turn around, I didn't run, I just kept walking, a small smile on my face, despite the goosebumps on my arms. Whatever's out there, we've developed a strange kind of relationship, a mutual curiosity, an unspoken agreement to acknowledge each other's existence without crossing certain boundaries. The Cowichan Valley is their territory. I'm just a visitor. And sometimes, when the conditions are right, they let me know they're there, watching, waiting, wondering about me just as much as I wonder about them. Story 14. This happened back in July of 2014. Me and 4 of my friends decided to go camping on San Juan Island in Washington for a weekend. We'd been planning it for a while. Just a simple summer camping trip, nothing crazy. We're all pretty experienced with the outdoors, so when we got there, we decided to skip the main campground with all the other tourists and families. We wanted something more secluded, you know, so we hiked about an hour and a half inland until we found this perfect little clearing near the forest line. It was beautiful, this small meadow with tall grass surrounded by dense forest. We set up our 3 tents in a small semicircle facing a fire pit we made with rocks. We had our backpacks hung in the trees to keep food away from smaller animals, which I now realize was pointless given what happened. And we had a cooler with our perishable stuff. We even brought camp chairs, one of those luxuries you don't really need, but appreciate when you're sitting around a fire at night. That first day was completely normal. We hiked around, explored some of the surrounding forest, cooked dinner on our portable stove, and just hung out. As the sun started to set, we built a fire and sat around drinking beers and talking. It was exactly what you'd expect from a camping trip with friends. But right as it was getting dark, and I mean just as the sun was fully gone, something changed. The forest went completely silent. At first, I didn't even notice it. Then one of my friends, Mike, mentioned how quiet it had gotten. That's when I realized I couldn't hear any insects, no birds, nothing. Just absolute silence. It was like someone had hit a mute button on the entire forest. We joked about it being weird, but honestly didn't think too much of it. We figured maybe a storm was coming or something. After a few more hours by the fire, we decided to turn in for the night. I shared a tent with Mike, and our other 3 friends were in the other 2 tents. I'd been in my sleeping bag for maybe an hour, just on the edge of falling asleep when I heard it. Heavy footsteps in the brush around our campsite. Not like a deer or something small. These were heavy, deliberate steps crushing branches and leaves. It sounded like someone was walking around our camp. I whispered to Mike, "Do you hear that?" And he was already wide awake. "Yeah," he whispered back. "What the hell is that?" That's when one of our camp chairs went flying through the air and crashed somewhere near the tents. I nearly jumped out of my skin. It wasn't just knocked over. It was literally thrown with enough force that we could hear it whooshing through the air before it hit the ground. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Mike and I were frozen, not saying anything, just listening. I could hear whispers from the other tents too, so I knew everyone was awake. Then the cooler, a pretty heavy cooler full of food and drinks, was picked up and slammed against the ground so hard that the lid popped open. We could hear our food scattering everywhere. Whatever was out there was strong enough to throw around a loaded cooler, like it was nothing. What happened next still gives me chills. Our backpacks, which we had hung probably 15 feet up in the trees, came crashing down through the branches and landed just feet from our tents. They didn't fall. They were thrown down with incredible force. That's when the smell hit us. It was this overwhelming, musky animal odor, like wet dog mixed with something rotten. The air was thick with it, and it made my eyes water. It was a smell I'd never encountered before, and hope to never smell again. The footsteps continued, circling our campsite, not quickly, but methodically, like whatever it was checking us out from all angles. I was clutching my phone, debating whether to try to call for help, though we had almost no signal out there, or use the flashlight to see what was happening. But I was too terrified to move. Then there was this sound, like something hit a tree with tremendous force, not once, but repeatedly. Boom, boom, boom. It sounded like someone was taking a sledgehammer to the trunk of a tree. The whole ground seemed to vibrate with each impact, and then the howl. God, that howl. It wasn't like a wolf or any animal I've ever heard. It was deep and long and so loud that I felt it vibrate through my chest. It didn't sound like an animal at all. It was almost human-like, but distorted and amplified to an impossible level. Mike grabbed my arm so hard it left bruises the next day. "What the fuck is that?" he hissed. I couldn't answer. I was literally paralyzed with fear. Someone in one of the other tents, I think it was Ben, had turned on a flashlight. The beam was pointing toward what remained of our fire, just a few glowing embers at this point, and that's when I saw it. Standing at the edge of the clearing, partially hidden among the trees but clearly visible in the dim light, was... I don't even know how to describe it properly. It was massive, like impossibly big for any normal animal. It had broad shoulders, long arms that hung down past what would be its knees, and its entire body was covered in dark hair or fur. Its head seemed to sit directly on those shoulders, without much of a neck, and even from that distance, I could see the size and bulk of it. It was a Sasquatch, a fucking Bigfoot. I know how that sounds, believe me. I never believed in any of that cryptid bullshit before this happened, but there's no other way to describe what we all saw. As we watched, frozen in horror, it reached up and tore a branch clean off one of the trees. Not a small branch, but one that had to be at least 4 inches thick. It snapped it like it was nothing and then threw it across the clearing. The branch smashed into another tree with a crack that sounded like a gunshot. Then it started throwing our stuff. It picked up our cooking gear and hurled it high into the trees. Some of it came back down, some of it didn't. It threw rocks, branches, anything it could find, all while making these low, grunting noises that somehow were scarier than the howls. It paced back and forth along the edge of the clearing, never coming fully into the open, but never leaving either. Every few minutes, it would let out another one of those bone-chilling howls that seemed to echo forever in the stillness of the night. None of us moved. We barely breathed. I remember thinking this must be what prey feels like when it knows it's being hunted, that complete, paralyzing terror. At one point, I heard Jeff in the tent next to us whisper, "Should we make a run for it?" But no one answered him. We all knew there was no way we could outrun whatever this thing was, and we were at least an hour's hike from any kind of help or civilization. We were trapped. This went on for hours, literal hours. The creature would sometimes disappear into the darkness for a few minutes, and we'd think maybe it was gone, but then we'd hear a branch snap or another howl and realize it was still there, circling, watching. Sometimes it would throw more things or break more branches. Sometimes it would just pace back and forth at the edge of our clearing, those heavy footsteps impossibly loud in the silent forest. Around what must have been 3 or 4 in the morning, I heard a different sound, a kind of heavy breathing, very close to our tent, like it was standing right outside the thin fabric wall, just listening to us. I could smell that musky odor stronger than ever, and I swear I could feel its presence through the tent, like a physical weight pressing in on us. Mike was shaking so hard next to me that I could feel his tremors through my sleeping bag. I had to put my hand over my mouth to stop myself from making any noise. I was sure, absolutely certain, that if we made any sudden movements or sounds, it would tear through the tent and grab us. But it didn't. After what felt like an eternity, the breathing moved away, and the footsteps receded slightly. As the sky finally began to lighten with dawn, the activity seemed to decrease. The footsteps became more distant, the howls stopped, and gradually the normal sounds of the forest began to return. A few early morning birds, the buzzing of insects. None of us moved until the sun was fully up. Even then, we called out to each other from inside our tents, afraid to be the first one to go outside. Finally, we all emerged together. The campsite was destroyed, completely and utterly wrecked. Our gear was scattered everywhere, some of it hanging from trees, some of it smashed beyond repair. The cooler was about 50 feet from where we'd left it, its contents strewn all over the ground. One of the camp chairs was completely missing. We never found it. The others were broken, bent metal frames twisted like they were made of pipe cleaners. But the most chilling thing was the footprints. They were everywhere around our campsite, massive impressions pressed deep into the dirt, way bigger than any human foot, with 5 distinct toes. Some of the prints were so deep that you could fit your hand into them up to the wrist. Whatever made them was not only huge but incredibly heavy. There were broken branches everywhere, not small twigs, but substantial limbs that had been snapped clean off the trees surrounding our camp. Some of the breaks were 15 feet up or higher, far beyond what a person could reach without a ladder. We didn't say much as we packed up what remained of our gear. We just wanted to get the hell out of there as fast as possible. The hike back to the main campground was tense, all of us constantly looking over our shoulders, jumping at every sound. We debated whether to report what happened, but ultimately decided against it. Who would believe us? We'd sound like crazy people or hoaxers. And honestly, I was afraid that talking about it would somehow make it more real, when a part of me desperately wanted to convince myself it had been some kind of shared hallucination. But it wasn't. 5 people don't hallucinate the same thing. 5 people don't imagine footprints or destroyed camping gear or branches snapped off 15 feet up trees. It's been years now, and I still have nightmares about that night. Still wake up sometimes hearing that howl in my head. Still feel that sense of being watched, hunted. I don't go camping anymore. None of us do, and I'll never set foot on San Juan Island again. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, whatever it was. If it's watching other campers, circling their tents in the dead of night. And sometimes, when I can't sleep, I wonder why it didn't attack us. Why it just destroyed our camp and terrified us, but never actually harmed us. Maybe we were just lucky, or maybe it was warning us, telling us to get off its territory. Either way, I listened, and I'm never going back. Story 15. I still haven't told many people about what happened that day. Most wouldn't believe me anyway. Even typing this now, my hands get shaky remembering it all. But I need to share this with someone who might understand. It was early October, crisp but not too cold yet. My buddy and I decided to do our usual weekend hike in the National Forest, about 40 minutes from my place. We'd been going there for years. Dash knew the trails well, or at least we thought we did. The leaves were just starting to change, making that satisfying crunch under our boots. Normal day. Totally normal. That's what makes this whole thing even more messed up. We got there around 10 in the morning. The parking area was pretty empty, just an old pickup truck and a couple with a dog loading up to leave. We grabbed our backpacks, checked our water, and headed out on the trail we always took, the one that loops around the lake and then climbs up toward the ridge. About an hour in, we stopped for a snack break, sitting on some fallen logs, sharing a bag of trail mix, talking about stupid stuff, work drama, the game from last weekend, normal crap. I remember feeling so calm, like everything was right with the world. Man, that feeling didn't last long. We packed up and continued hiking. The trail got steeper as we started climbing toward the ridgeline. The trees were thicker here, mostly pine and some old oaks. The forest floor was covered in pine needles, which muffled our footsteps. I remember noticing how quiet it was. No birds, no squirrels rustling around. At the time, I thought maybe it was just getting too cold for them. But now, I know better. We were about halfway up the incline when we heard it. This sound. I've tried explaining it to people, but words don't really capture it. It was deep, like it came from something with a massive chest. A long, drawn-out noise that started like a moan, but ended almost like a scream. But not a human scream. Nothing human makes a sound like that. It echoed through the trees, making it hard to tell where it was coming from. We both stopped dead in our tracks. I looked at my buddy, and his face had gone completely white. "What the hell was that?" he whispered. I shook my head. "Bear, maybe. Mountain lion." But I knew it wasn't either of those. I'd heard bears and mountain lions before. This was something else. We stood perfectly still, listening. The forest was dead quiet again. Too quiet. "Should we head back?" he asked. I was about to say yes when we heard it again. Same sound, but closer this time. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. My mouth went dry. "Let's just keep moving," I said. "But stay alert." We continued hiking, but slower now, constantly scanning the trees around us. Every few minutes we'd stop to listen. Nothing but silence. We'd been walking for maybe another 15 minutes when my buddy grabbed my arm hard enough to leave a bruise. "Look," he whispered, pointing to our left. "By that big pine." At first I didn't see anything, just trees and underbrush. Then I noticed some movement, and that's when I saw it. Behind a massive tree trunk, partially hidden, was a head. Just a head peering out, watching us. It had this heavy brow, dark skin or fur, I couldn't tell which from that distance, and these deep-set eyes. They weren't animal eyes, they weren't human eyes either. They were aware, intelligent, studying us. We froze. It froze. For what felt like forever, but was probably only 30 seconds, we just stared at each other. I couldn't even breathe. My legs felt like they were cemented to the ground. Then, without warning, it moved. It turned and ran deeper into the forest. But it wasn't on all fours. It ran on two legs, fast. really fast, much faster than a human could move through dense underbrush. It was wide, broad shoulders, thick build, and tall, maybe around 6 feet. The way it moved was fluid but powerful, pushing small trees out of its way like they were nothing. Once it disappeared from view, we both let out the breath we'd been holding. "Did you see that?" My buddy's voice was trembling. I nodded, unable to form words. That couldn't have been... "Let's get out of here," I said, finally finding my voice. "Now." We turned around and started heading back down the trail, moving as quickly as we could without running. Running felt like it would trigger something, like prey fleeing from a predator. So we walked fast, constantly looking around us, jumping at every snapping twig or rustling leaf. About halfway back to the parking area, we heard that moaning scream again. This time it seemed to come from behind us. Then, seconds later, we heard it again from somewhere to our right, then left. It was like whatever made that sound was circling us, calling to others. "There's more than one," my buddy whispered, his face drained of color. I didn't want to believe it, but the evidence was right there in our ears. Multiple calls, different directions, all with that same haunting quality. We picked up our pace, almost jogging now. The trail seemed longer on the way back, stretching out endlessly before us. The sun was starting to lower in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees. Every shadow looked like a figure standing still, watching us pass. When we finally reached the parking lot, we practically dove into the car. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so bad I could barely get them in the ignition. As we pulled out of the lot, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The tree line was still, no movement, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The drive home was silent. What do you say after something like that? "Hey, so I think we just saw Bigfoot." It sounds insane. Even now typing this out, I know how it sounds, but I know what I saw, what we both saw. That wasn't our only encounter, though. We've gone back to those woods. I know, probably stupid, but something keeps pulling us back. Like we need to know, need to understand, and every time we've heard that same moaning scream at least once. It's become almost familiar now, though it still sends chills down my spine. There was another time, about 3 weeks after the first incident. I was alone this time. Another dumb decision, I know. I'd climbed up into a pine tree, about 15 feet up. I don't know why, just felt like I needed a different perspective of the forest. I was sitting on a thick branch, leaning against the trunk, when I got this feeling, like when you know someone's staring at you in a crowded room. I looked down and saw nothing at first, just forest floor, pine needles, some fallen branches. But then I sensed movement directly below me, not animal movement, something bigger. I broke off a small branch and dropped it just to see if I'd get a reaction. I did. A dark figure stood up from where it had been crouching or sitting. It had been right below me the whole time. It looked up, and even through the branches I could feel those eyes lock onto mine. Then it turned and ran on 2 legs into the thicker part of the forest. Same fluid, powerful movement, same impossible speed. My heart was hammering so hard I thought I might fall out of the tree. I stayed up there for another hour before I worked up the courage to climb down and sprint back to my car. We've seen them several other times since then, usually at dusk or dawn when the light is low. Tall, upright figures moving rapidly through the trees. Sometimes just one, sometimes what seems like 3 or 4. They never approach us directly, but they don't seem afraid either. More curious. Watching. I've done research since then, looked up every animal native to our region. Nothing matches what we've seen. I've read accounts from other people who claim to have seen similar things in different parts of the country. The descriptions match. The height, the build, the way they move, that unforgettable sound. I know this is going to sound crazy, but I'm convinced we encountered what most people would call Bigfoot. Not just once, but repeatedly. They live in those woods. They watch us when we're there. They communicate with each other using those haunting calls. I still go hiking there sometimes. People think I'm nuts, but I feel like I need to understand, need to see more. My buddy won't come anymore, says he's had enough to last a lifetime, but I can't stay away. Last time I went, about 2 weeks ago, I brought a camera, thought maybe I could get proof, something to show people that I'm not making this up. I hiked until sunset, hearing those moans occasionally but seeing nothing. As it got dark, I decided to head back. That's when I saw it, standing in the middle of the trail about 50 yards ahead, fully visible this time, massive, covered in dark hair or fur. Standing upright on 2 legs, its arms hanging at its sides, longer than human arms should be. It just stood there, watching me. I fumbled for my camera, hands trembling. By the time I got it out and looked up, the figure was gone. Not a sound, not a footprint, just gone. My camera sat useless in my shaking hands. I don't know what to do with this experience. I don't know if I'll ever get proof that others will believe. But I know what I saw. What I continue to see. There's something in those woods that science hasn't explained. Something intelligent that watches us from the shadows. Sometimes at night, I wake up thinking I hear that moan scream right outside my window. It's never there, of course, just the wind, or my imagination running wild. But the feeling remains, the feeling of being studied by something that understands more about us than we understand about it. I'm going back next weekend. I know it's probably stupid, but I need to know more, need to understand. Maybe this time I'll get my proof. Or maybe this time they'll decide to do more than just watch. Story 16. My buddy Jake and I had spent the day fishing off the coast near the Everglades National Park. We're both Miami locals and have been exploring the backwaters and mangroves since we were kids. That night, we were heading back home around 11 at night, taking this dirt road that cuts through near Black Point Marina. It's a shortcut we've used dozens of times, real isolated, barely maintained, with mangroves pressing in on both sides. Usually, we just see raccoons or maybe the occasional deer. The road is super dark. No streetlights out there, just our headlights cutting through the pitch black. We were about halfway down the road, talking about how the fishing had been disappointing that day when we noticed something weird up ahead. At first, I thought it was just the reflection of our headlights on something metallic, but as we got closer, we could make out the shape of a car, a blue Chevy sedan. The thing is, the car was moving. Not like it was driving, it was parked, but rocking violently from side to side. I remember thinking maybe it was some teenagers fooling around, you know. I slowed down, partly out of curiosity, partly because the way the car was moving seemed off. Jake said something like, "What the hell is going on over there?" As we got within about 50 yards, our headlights finally caught what was causing the rocking, and I nearly drove off the road in shock. There was this thing on the driver's side of the Chevy. I still struggle to describe it accurately. It was massive, easily 9 feet tall, maybe more. It was standing on 2 legs like a person, but it was covered in this thick, dark black hair all over its body. Not fur exactly, more like long hair, especially around the shoulders and back. The creature, I don't know what else to call it, had its hands on the roof of the car and was rocking it back and forth like it weighed nothing. The Chevy was bouncing on its suspension, tilting so far that I thought it might flip over. I could hear the metal creaking even from inside our truck with the windows up. What really got to me was how strong this thing had to be. I'm not exaggerating when I say it was lifting the side of a sedan off the ground with what looked like minimal effort. The car probably weighs around 3,000 pounds, and this thing was playing with it like a toy. I stopped our truck about 30 yards away, and we just sat there in complete shock for a few seconds. Jake was gripping the dashboard so hard his knuckles were white, I couldn't even speak. The headlights were now fully illuminating the scene. and I could see that the Chevy's windows were fogged up from the inside, and I could make out what looked like someone frantically moving around in there. Then, the driver's door of the Chevy burst open, and this guy practically fell out onto the ground. He scrambled to his feet and started sprinting toward our truck. The creature seemed startled for a moment, then it turned its head toward our headlights. That's when I got the clearest look at it. Its face wasn't quite human, but it wasn't exactly like an ape either. It had this pronounced brow ridge and a flattened nose, but the eyes are what I can't forget. They caught the light and seemed to glow slightly, but what struck me was how aware they looked. Not animal eyes. There was intelligence there, and when it stared at our truck, I felt this primal fear shoot through me like nothing I've ever experienced before. The creature stood up straight. God, it was tall, and for a horrible moment I thought it was going to charge us. Instead, it turned and moved toward the mangroves on the side of the road. It didn't run like a person. It had this weird, powerful gait that covered ground incredibly quickly. Within seconds, it had disappeared into the dense growth. The mangroves there are thick and tangled, nearly impenetrable in places. But this thing moved through them like they weren't even there. By this time, the driver from the Chevy had reached our truck. I unlocked the back door, and he practically dove inside, yelling for us to go, go, go. I didn't need to be told twice. I hit the gas, and we tore down that dirt road faster than was safe, throwing up clouds of dust behind us. The guy in our back seat was in his 30s, I'd guess. He was shaking so badly he could barely speak. His clothes were soaked with sweat, and he had this wild look in his eyes. When he finally managed to talk, his voice kept cracking, and he had to stop several times to catch his breath. According to him, he'd been driving home from visiting a friend who lived out near the edge of the Everglades. He said he'd been on that dirt road for maybe 5 minutes when something big stepped out in front of his car. He slammed on the brakes to avoid hitting it, and his headlights illuminated what he first thought was a bear standing on its hind legs. Then it walked toward his car on 2 legs, and he realized it wasn't a bear. He tried to reverse, but in his panic, he stalled the car. Before he could restart it, the creature was at his driver's side window, looking in at him. He said it was so tall that it had to bend down to peer through the window. He locked his doors and tried to restart the car, but by then, the creature had put its hands on the hood. It started pushing the car, rocking it slightly at first, then more violently. He said it seemed almost curious, like it was testing the car to see what it was or how sturdy it was. When the rocking got really bad, he was thrown around inside, hitting his head on the steering wheel and then the side window. He thought the car was going to flip over. That's when he decided his only chance was to try to run for it. He waited until the creature was on the passenger side, then unlocked his door and bolted. While he was telling us this, he kept looking back over his shoulder like he expected to see the thing following us. We were all completely freaked out. I drove straight to a gas station about 15 minutes away, the first well-lit public place I could think of. We all just sat in the parking lot for almost an hour trying to process what had happened. The guy, I never even got his name, that's how rattled we all were, called his wife to come pick him up. He didn't want to call the police. "What am I gonna tell them?" he kept saying. "That Bigfoot attacked my car? They'll breathalyze me and throw me in a cell." While we waited for his wife, Jake walked over to look at the Chevy guy's car. He came back looking even more disturbed. "Dude," he said quietly, "his car has these massive dents on the roof and hood, like deep impressions where something pressed down hard enough to warp the metal. I offered to drive back with the guy to get his car once his wife arrived, but he adamantly refused to go anywhere near that road again. Can't say I blamed him. I haven't been back there either. The 3 of us made this unspoken agreement not to talk about what we'd seen. What would be the point? Who would believe us? I've spent hours online since then, researching sightings in the Everglades area. There are more reports than you'd think, though nothing exactly like what we experienced. I keep thinking about those eyes. and the intelligence I saw in them. Whatever that creature was, it wasn't just some animal. The way it examined the car, the way it reacted to our headlights. There was reasoning there, and the strength, Jesus, the strength it had. I've worked construction for years and I've seen hydraulic machinery that couldn't rock a car like that thing did with its bare hands. Sometimes I wonder if I should report it to someone, some authority or research group or whatever. But then I remember the look on that guy's face when he was trying to explain why he didn't want to call the police, and I understand completely. People don't want to hear this stuff. They'll think you're crazy or drunk or making it up for attention. The few times I've tried to talk to Jake about it since, he shuts down the conversation immediately. Last time I brought it up, about a month ago, he just said, "Some things you see, and then you just let them be." I think that's his way of coping, but I can't stop thinking about it. Every time I drive near wooded areas now, especially at night, my heart rate spikes. I keep checking my rearview mirror, expecting to see that massive silhouette again. I've lived in Florida all my life, spent countless hours in the Everglades, and never once felt unsafe there until now. The rational part of my brain keeps trying to explain it away. Maybe it was someone in a costume. Maybe it was a bear, and the darkness and fear distorted our perception. But deep down, I know what I saw. We all do. Whatever it was, it's still out there in those mangroves. And the worst part is, until that night, how many times had I been fishing or hiking in those same areas, completely unaware that something like that was watching from the shadows? How many times had I been completely vulnerable without even knowing it? I don't go fishing near Black Point anymore. Jake says he doesn't either. As for the guy whose car got attacked, I have no idea how he's doing. I sometimes wonder if he's been able to make sense of what happened, or if he lies awake at night like I do, replaying those terrifying moments over and over, trying to convince himself it wasn't real. But it was real. I saw it with my own eyes, and now I can't unsee it. Story 17. This happened during deer season last fall. My husband Mark and I headed up to Eagle Meadows above Strawberry, California. We've been hunting there for years. It's this beautiful area in the Sierra Nevada with perfect spots for deer hunting. The meadow we were set up at is about 300 yards wide, surrounded by thick forest. Perfect place for deer to cross from one side to the other. That morning started like any other hunting trip. We got to our spot before dawn, applied this god-awful skunk scent to mask our human smell. Seriously, that stuff is the worst, but it works. And then separated to our positions. We positioned ourselves under two different pine trees, about 10 feet apart from each other, both with good views of the meadow. There was this clump of trees and brush about 100 yards ahead that partially blocked our view, but we figured we'd still be able to spot any deer moving through. The sunrise that morning was gorgeous, all oranges and pinks breaking through the trees. It was late October, so there was this crisp chill in the air, but not uncomfortable once you got your layers on. I remember feeling particularly alert that morning, like all my senses were heightened. Maybe that was my body's way of preparing me for what was about to happen. We'd been sitting there for about 20 minutes, dead quiet like you have to be when hunting. I was just starting to get that slight numbness in my butt from sitting on the cold ground when I heard it, branches breaking from across the meadow. I immediately perked up, thinking it was a deer. I slowly raised my rifle, careful not to make any sudden movements, and scanned the tree line with my scope. At first, I didn't see anything. But then I noticed something dark that definitely hadn't been there before. It was partially obscured by the trees, but something was definitely there. I lowered my rifle and grabbed my binoculars for a better look. That's when I saw them. Two yellow eyes staring directly at me. Not like a deer's eyes at all. These eyes were forward-facing, intelligent, and focused with an intensity that made my skin crawl. They were set in a dark face that I couldn't fully make out through the foliage. but what I could see wasn't anything I recognized. I froze, completely froze. I couldn't even breathe. Those eyes were locked on mine with such deliberate focus that I knew whatever was watching me wasn't just some animal that had wandered by. It knew I was there. It was studying me. For what felt like forever, but was probably about 15 minutes, we just stared at each other. Neither of us moved. I was afraid to even shift my weight. My mind was racing, trying to identify what I was looking at. Too tall for a bear, especially given the height of those eyes from the ground. Wrong shape for a moose or elk, and the stillness. No wild animal stands perfectly still for that long while staring directly at a human. I remember my thoughts becoming increasingly panicked. Was it curious about me? Was it sizing me up? Was it waiting for me to make a move? I had my rifle, but something told me that wouldn't matter much if this thing decided to come for me. The distance between us was maybe 200 yards, and I realized with growing horror that it could probably cross that space a lot faster than I could get away. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure Mark could hear it, even though he was several feet away. I didn't dare look at him or signal to him yet. I couldn't take my eyes off those yellow ones staring back at me. The longer we stared at each other, the more certain I became that I was looking at something that shouldn't exist. The shape I could make out behind those eyes was large, upright, and dark, possibly covered in hair or fur. The head seemed slightly conical, not round like a human's, and those eyes, they held an intelligence that made my blood run cold. There was something calculating in that gaze, something that told me this wasn't just an animal acting on instinct. The morning had warmed slightly, but I was shivering, not from cold, but from fear, a primal fear I'd never experienced before. My mouth was completely dry, and I could feel sweat trickling down my back despite the cool air. After about 15 minutes of this standoff, I couldn't take it anymore. The fear had built to a point where I felt like I might pass out or scream. I needed to get out of there. I finally broke eye contact and slowly, very slowly, turned my head just enough to catch Mark's attention. I made a small hand motion to indicate I was leaving. He looked confused, but nodded slightly. I didn't try to explain. I didn't want to speak or make any sudden movements. I just wanted to get away from those eyes. With painstaking slowness, I started to back away, never turning my back on the meadow. Those yellow eyes tracked my movement the entire time, still not blinking, still not moving from their position. When I felt I'd backed up enough to be partially concealed by trees, I turned and walked as quickly as I could without running back toward our camp. The entire time, I felt those eyes on me, burning into my back. I kept expecting to hear heavy footsteps charging through the meadow behind me, but there was nothing, just the sound of my own ragged breathing and the crunch of pine needles under my boots. I made it back to our camp and practically collapsed by the fire pit. My legs were shaking so badly I could barely stand. I kept looking back toward the meadow, terrified I'd see a massive shape emerging from the trees, but nothing came. About an hour later, Mark returned to camp. He looked worried and asked why I'd left so suddenly. When I asked if he'd seen anything unusual, he said no, just some birds and squirrels, no deer, and certainly nothing else. He hadn't seen what I'd been staring at. Even though he'd been just 10 feet away from me, the angle must have been just right for me to see it, but wrong for him. The fact that Mark hadn't seen anything cross the meadow after I left tells me that whatever it was hadn't moved from its spot. It had just stood there watching. Maybe it had been there long before we arrived, silently observing us the whole time. The thought makes me sick to my stomach even now. We packed up and left that afternoon. I made up some excuse about not feeling well, and Mark, bless him, didn't push it. I couldn't bring myself to tell him what I'd seen right then. I was still trying to process it myself. It wasn't until we were safely home that night that I finally told him about the yellow eyes. He was skeptical at first. Suggested maybe it was a bear standing on its hind legs, or just a trick of the light on some foliage. but a bear wouldn't stand completely still for 15 minutes, staring without moving. And the height of those eyes, they had to have been 7 or 8 feet off the ground, too high for a bear, even standing. In the months since, I've done a lot of research. I've looked at reports of animal sightings in that area, trying to find some explanation. But I keep coming back to one conclusion. What I saw that morning was a Sasquatch. I know how that sounds. Before this happened, I'd have laughed at anyone who claimed they'd seen Bigfoot, but those eyes, there was something in them that wasn't animal, wasn't quite human either. Something ancient and aware. I haven't been back to Eagle Meadows since, and I don't think I ever will. Mark still hunts there occasionally, but always with a group now, never just the two of us. He says he's never seen anything unusual, but he doesn't stay until dusk anymore either. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, my heart racing, feeling like those yellow eyes are watching me through my bedroom window. I know they're not, but that feeling of being observed, of being hunted, hasn't completely left me. What bothers me most is the deliberateness of it all. This wasn't a random animal encounter. Whatever watched me that day chose to reveal itself to me, but stay hidden from Mark. It chose to stand perfectly still and stare me down, rather than flee or approach. It was intelligent enough to understand the concept of a standoff, to recognize that I was aware of its presence. I still have my binoculars from that day. Sometimes I pick them up and remember the moment those yellow eyes came into focus. It's a memory that's burned into my mind. The sudden realization that I wasn't looking at something known, something catalogued and understood by science. I was looking at something that exists in the shadows of our world, something that chooses when to be seen and when to remain hidden. I've never told this story publicly before. I'm not looking for attention or to convince anyone. I just needed to share this with people who might understand, who might not immediately dismiss me as crazy or confused. I know what I saw that day. Those yellow eyes were real, and they were looking right through me. And sometimes, when I'm in the woods now, even just hiking on a popular trail near home, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched again, that somewhere in the trees, those same yellow eyes are tracking my movements, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal themselves once more. Story 18. I still think about that day sometimes. It's been 4 months since my wife and I saw whatever that was by the Carbon River, and I can't shake it. I've never really believed in the supernatural or cryptids or any of that stuff. I'm still not sure I do, but I know what we saw. And it wasn't normal. It was early October, and we'd decided to take advantage of the unseasonably warm weather before the Pacific Northwest rains settled in for the winter. We packed our mountain bikes onto the rack and drove out to Mount Rainier National Park. We'd been there dozens of times before. It's one of our favorite places to ride and hike. That morning started perfectly normal. We parked at the main lot near the Carbon River entrance, unloaded our bikes, and set off on one of the trails we'd ridden many times. The air had that crisp fall feeling, but the sun was warm on our backs. The forest was quiet except for the occasional bird call and the sound of our tires on the packed dirt. After about an hour of riding, we came to this viewpoint we always stop at. It's nothing special or marked on any map. Just a natural clearing where the trees thin out and you can see down into the valley where the Carbon River winds through. The river was running low that time of year, exposing more of the grey riverbed stones than usual. We propped our bikes against a fallen log, took off our helmets, and just stood there catching our breath, taking in the view. My wife was sipping from her water bottle when she nudged my arm. "Look at that guy down there," she said, pointing toward the riverbed about 100 yards below us. I squinted in the direction she was pointing and saw what at first glance looked like a tall person walking along the riverbed. From our vantage point, they appeared to be wearing something dark. My first impression was a long coat or maybe a dark raincoat. I remember thinking it was strange that someone would be wearing something so heavy on such a warm day. "What's he doing down there?" I asked. "There's no trail through that part of the riverbed." The figure was moving from our right to left, walking parallel to the river, but in the actual riverbed itself, which was mostly exposed except for a narrow channel of water running through it. And that's when I noticed the first really strange thing. The riverbed there isn't easy to walk on. It's covered in boulders of all sizes, from softball-sized rocks to ones as big as coffee tables. Anyone who's hiked around rivers knows you have to carefully pick your way across, especially when the rocks are slick. But this figure was just striding smoothly across, taking these massive steps from rock to rock without pausing or adjusting its balance. It moved with this fluid, confident gait that seemed impossible considering the terrain. "That's weird," I said, leaning forward a bit. "Look how it's walking." My wife had noticed too. "Yeah, that's not right." We both just stood there watching, and the longer we looked, the less human it seemed. I started noticing details that didn't add up. There was no separation between what I'd thought was a coat and pants, no visible hands or shoes, no backpack or hiking gear, just this uniformly dark figure. "Are those arms?" my wife whispered. The limbs were long, way too long, hanging almost to the knees, and the proportions were off somehow. The torso seemed too short for the legs, the head seemed a bit small, and sat directly on the shoulders with no visible neck. I felt the hair on my arms stand up. What had seemed like clothing just moments before now clearly wasn't. The entire figure was covered in what looked like dark hair or fur, not black, but a deep dark brown that looked almost black from a distance. There were no color variations, no clothing lines or fabric folds, just this continuous covering from head to toe. "That's not a person," I said quietly, as if saying it too loudly might make it hear me, even though we were far away. We stood frozen, just staring. The figure continued its steady pace across the riverbed, moving from boulder to boulder with impossible grace. It must have been at least 7 feet tall, maybe taller. The way it moved was so unnatural, not uncoordinated or awkward, but too smooth, too effortless for the terrain. I've tried explaining this to people since then, and it's hard to convey just how wrong the movement looked. Imagine watching an Olympic gymnast doing flips and jumps that seem to defy physics. It's that kind of unnatural, but in the opposite direction, not jerky or robotic, but so fluid it couldn't possibly be human. We must have watched it for only 20 or 30 seconds, but it felt like forever. I remember thinking I should grab my phone to take a picture, but I couldn't move. It was like my brain was struggling to process what my eyes were seeing. My wife and I exchanged this look, this wide-eyed, "Are you seeing this too?" Look that confirmed we were both witnessing the same thing, and that's when it happened. We looked back at the figure, and at that exact moment, and I mean the precise second our eyes went back to it, it turned its head, not just glanced in our direction, but rotated its entire head sideways in one fluid motion, like an owl. It was at least 100 yards away, but I swear it looked directly at us, made deliberate eye contact. I couldn't make out facial features clearly from that distance, but I could feel it staring. The intensity of that gaze hit me like a physical force. And the whole time, it never broke stride, never slowed down or stopped walking, just turned its head completely sideways, locked eyes with us, and kept moving at the same steady pace. My stomach dropped. Every instinct in my body screamed danger. I felt exposed, vulnerable, like I'd been spotted by a predator. My wife grabbed my arm so hard it left marks that didn't fade until the next day. "We need to go," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Now." I couldn't agree more. We backed away slowly, not taking our eyes off the figure until it disappeared behind a stand of trees on the far side of the riverbed. The second it was out of sight, we scrambled for our bikes, fumbling with our helmets with trembling hands. I've never gotten on my bike so fast in my life. We didn't speak a word as we pedaled back to the car, pushing harder than we ever had on that trail. Every crack of a twig, every rustle in the underbrush made me pedal faster. The 3 miles back to the parking lot felt like 30. When we finally reached the car, we threw our bikes on the rack without bothering to secure them properly. Only once we were inside the car with the doors locked did we finally speak. "What the fuck was that?" my wife asked, her voice still trembling. "I don't know," was all I could say. I started the car with shaking hands and pulled out of the lot way too fast. We drove in silence for several minutes before trying to process what we'd seen. We went back and forth, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a very tall hiker wearing some kind of unusual gear. But we both knew that explanation didn't fit what we saw. The proportions were wrong, the movement was wrong, and that head turn, that deliberate, impossible head turn that somehow acknowledged our presence from such a distance. When we got home, we started researching. I've never been into Bigfoot or Sasquatch stories, always thought they were just myths or misidentifications. But what we saw matches so many descriptions from this area: the height, the dark hair, the fluid movement across difficult terrain. The Carbon River area has had sightings before, apparently. Here's the thing that really gets me. We weren't looking for anything strange that day. We weren't out squatching, or whatever they call it. We were just two normal people out for a bike ride who happened to see something we can't explain. If you'd asked me about Bigfoot before that day, I'd have laughed it off. Now, I don't know what to think. I've gone back and forth about posting this. My wife doesn't want to talk about it anymore. She says thinking about it gives her nightmares, but I can't stop thinking about that moment when it turned and looked at us. The deliberateness of it, the awareness. That's the part that haunts me most. It knew we were there, it knew we were watching it, and it wanted us to know that it knew. I don't know if it was actually a Bigfoot or Sasquatch or whatever you want to call it. All I know is what we saw wasn't human, and it moved through that impossible terrain like it was walking on a sidewalk. And somehow, from 100 yards away, it sensed us watching and made direct eye contact. We haven't been back to that trail since. I'm not sure we ever will. Sometimes when I'm alone in the woods now, even in completely different areas, I get this feeling I'm being watched. I never had that feeling before that day. I've tried telling myself there's a logical explanation, but deep down I know what I saw, and I know that whatever it was saw me too.